Okay, welcome to Jesus Never Existed, episode 3. We'll probably give it a little bit of time for just the room to fill up with people listening so they could respond to anything I say, but just on the outset to lay out the general gist of the debate, it's on the one hand, we would have a historical Jesus who was the founder of Christianity, and on the other hand, we would have someone else founding Christianity and Jesus being the deity that they worshipped. So, for example, Peter founding Christianity and praying to Jesus versus Jesus founding Christianity and then dying and then someone taking his place, and then that switch happening. So it's an interesting question to debate. There's a lot of interesting evidence in history. There's a lot of scholarship which has been done on both sides of this. More recently tends to be towards mythicism, but there is some ancient scholarship that would argue for a historical Jesus. So it's interesting to just debate these points back and forth. And if anybody feels like calling in, talking any particular details, I'd welcome some interaction because I'm sure it's boring for people just to listen to me monologue all the time. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for calling in. You're currently muted.
How about now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hey, yeah, but I've actually just had discussions with you in prior debate groups before this, which I think that we've had civil conversations, if I'm not mistaken. So it shouldn't be a problem to engage in these discussions with you because, from what I can recall from our past, we were not quarrelsome to one another. So anyway, to move on with it, there was a few things that you said. I don't know, you didn't speak for very long. I was kind of hoping to pick up more of your insight. But some of the things that you were mentioning was, the apostles worshiping Jesus as their deity, basically like an insinuation of invention of Christ. If I'm, is that what you were meaning when you said that?
Yeah, so I'm looking at this from the historical perspective. So, a normal human Jesus versus an invented character Jesus. Tend not to worry too much about the divine Jesus, although I mean, we can discuss that if you like, but it's not my primary focus.
Okay, so can you enlighten me on what the primary focus is, per se?
So things that we could actually argue in terms of history. So basically,
Okay,
miracles
so
are,
okay, so
yeah.
this is a historical philosophical discussion.
Yeah. So historicity, because obviously we can't really debate the likelihood of miracles because by definition miracles are the least likely thing.
I
So we're talking
understand
about
that.
whether
I don't
the guy
disagree.
existed. Yeah.
Well, I mean, now see, part of the historicity of Jesus is some of miracles, such as the empty tomb, the earth that was confirmed by archaeologists where he was crucified and the earth split during the quake. So certain things like that. They do have a nail, what they assume maybe Jesus. I'm not saying maybe Jesus, one of Jesus's nails, but it is confined in a special locked in away area. Like it is not open for the public. It is like in a vault. But no one really can say 100% whether it's of Jesus. But we also have eyewitness accounts, and things like that. And Luke is actually recorded to be probably the best historian to have ever lived, and it has been confirmed by other historians, multiple. And the as far as the New Testament goes, um, if you do the research on the accuracy of the reliability of the New Testament, it's like 99.5%. And all four of the synoptic gospels refer to Jesus. Paul refers to Jesus. First, second, and third John refer to Jesus. So if the synoptic gospels are true, then what they say is true, and Jesus is what they say.
Can I just revisit? I think I forgot to write down the second point. You mentioned
No,
relics.
absolutely. Please, by all means.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned relics like a crack in the ground and a nail. You mentioned eyewitnesses. I think you talked about something between those 2 points. Do you remember what that
Yeah,
was?
I did mention those three. Yes, I did.
Yeah, so I've got relics, eyewitnesses, Luke being best historian, New Testament reliable. I swear there's something else you mentioned that I missed. I didn't want to skip over it if
Oh man, I
you
said
still
a
have that
lot.
in
I said
mind.
a mouthful. So just whatever you can remember. I did say,
It'll probably come to you as we discuss a little bit further, so
okay,
that's
all right,
fine.
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think there are any relics we can reliably date like back to the time and place, so it's kind of not great as evidence. I'm not aware of historians trying to use like physical evidence just because we don't know any of it traces back to Jesus. So there's not much we can do with that.
Right,
Eyewitness accounts.
right.
Yeah, if you wanted to respond to that, that's fine. Yeah.
Well, I understand what not being able to date back because that's another issue that's with the dating. However, that it's really also more evidence of Jesus and the fact that he did something great for our AD and BC to be dated the way it is, our
Well,
calendar that we go
okay,
by
that
now.
that one's hundreds of years later. That's like Gregorian Julian
Well,
calendar
yeah, I know
change, and
that, but
yeah.
it was calculated the by astronomy on where like the moon was calculated to be. So yeah, it was predated. So yes, some of the dating is inaccurate because it's an estimation. It's not, I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
some
kind
people
of
date,
it
yeah.
comes from
So
Bishop Usher, which is he's not a great source. He's not exactly an eyewitness, so I don't think that's helpful.
yeah, no, and
Um,
and there are several. There was two of them mainly. I want to say one of them was Fenmar, and I can't remember the other one's name, but those two are the ones that calculated the dating. But I mean, as far as the dating being inaccurate, um, it's really kind of opposes the point of, you know, it being there at all.
well,
Because if
so
we, I
so
mean,
the use of the calendar is more to do with the Roman Empire and its spread and
well,
influence on the Western world. So it's not
would you
really great
mind?
evidence for the first century.
No, I mean, but it is some. But see, this is what basically what I'm not expecting for me to say, oh, the empty tomb is evidence of Jesus, you should believe. Oh, the earthquake and archaeologists confirm it through live science and NBC News and all this other reliable sources. So believe
Well,
in Jesus
so
because it's
you
true.
mentioned eyewitnesses, which I would have thought that would be your primary evidence, right? That would be the best evidence, the eyewitness
No, well,
accounts.
I mean, if you take into consideration the Gospels. If the Gospels are taken into consideration when discussing the historical Jesus, then yes, that would be a factor.
Okay,
Uh,
so which ones do you think is the best eyewitness account, like the one that's you've got the strongest case for?
well, there's a few things. Like, I do believe that Paul is probably the strongest eyewitness, and more so of see
Well,
my
so just to clarify, I'm talking about a historical Jesus. We're not talking about the visionary deity because that
right.
exists
No,
on either
and
theory.
I knew you were going to mention that too.
Yeah,
Okay, so we have historical accounts. Uh, I don't know if you know. Do you know who Bart D. Ehrman is?
yeah, I've read all of his work. Well, almost all of it.
Oh man, look, I tell you what, I love his work too. But he mentions 15 uh, um, sources outside of Christianity, which basically means secular sources,
Yeah.
and they are all confirmed, and they all mention Jesus. Now, whether some of them, like we talked about before, the dating is off. But Bart Ehrman also dates back like the Book of Mark to like extremely early, like and not
About the
too long.
70s, I think.
Yes, no, man, look, I'm glad I'm talking to somebody that knows something. Okay, awesome. But yeah, so if that's the case, and we compare it to the other ancient transcripts and manuscripts we have about previous documents, previous things, or or things that were documented at that time, then that's how Jesus became the most historical figure to ever live, because he had, I think it was 49 to 46 sources, and 15 of them were secular. So even if you discredit all of the Christian sources, which is confirmation bias fallacy, but I don't think that either one of us
Well,
is
no.
doing that.
So discrediting a source would only be a fallacy if you didn't actually discredit it with evidence. That would only be a fallacy if you did it fallaciously, right?
Right. Yeah, that is correct. Yes.
But
yeah,
so I mean, do you want to look at eyewitness accounts, or do you want to look at extra biblical accounts? Because they're two
see me,
different
I'm gonna tell you, I'm
things.
gonna be honest with you. Like, okay, whenever I had my own doubts, whenever I wanted to find out for myself because I was tired of just receiving just what everybody said because they said it, then I stuck out for evidence. And the eyewitness evidence is actually my least amount of invested, because it, I have to look at it from the point of view that I had whenever I was doubting. If someone told me that someone saw and recorded Jesus, with the dating being inaccurate, how accurate is that statement? Because you cannot really tell if those documents were written at the time of the event. But there are primary and secondary sources that go back to all of the, what we mentioned earlier as being miracles of Jesus, such as the resurrection, rising from the, walking.
Well, so I was looking for, like, which one? Can you pick a specific eyewitness account? We can just look at that and how you know it's an eyewitness account. The way that history tends to operate. We want to look at the sources. How do we know what they say is accurate? How do we know who wrote them? All that stuff.
Well, the way that we know what's accurate is, okay, so the way it worked is, as far as eyewitness accounts, they were recorded. Now, some people say, I do believe that, John and Matthew and Peter were all eyewitnesses of Jesus. I do believe that, but that is not my strong evidence that I would say this is strong evidence of the existence of the historical Jesus. That wouldn't be it for me.
Oh,
What my
okay.
main
If you want to skip over the eyewitness accounts and go to your strongest, I'm just trying to get you to focus
we
on one.
can.
Just pick one.
Okay, well, pick which. What? Do you want to talk about the empty tomb, or do you want to discuss?
No, I mean
How about?
sources. So when you're talking about a source, I assume you mean a written document that you would rely on. So pick one of
Actually,
those.
it's not specifically a written source. It's multiple written sources confirmed by other reliable sources. So basically, it's
Yeah,
reliable
but you
sources
got to
confirmed
pick
by
one at a
other.
time. We've got to look at one source, right? We can look at whether it's confirmed by others, but you have to pick one first, because you're just talking about vague, general things here. I need something specific, like give me a name, and then we can go into that in detail. Because I don't want
A
you to just do
name
like all
pertaining
wishy-washy stuff,
to
right?
no, a name pertaining to what exactly? I'm trying to make sure I understand.
So you want your best source to make your case, because you want to I want to steel man your position. I want to make sure you make the strongest case. So I want to get your strongest source specifically, and then examine that to make sure it is actually a strong source. We want to be specific.
Okay, I would say the strongest source. Oh my gosh, that's a hard one.
If you think there's
Uh,
loads of equally strong ones, just pick one. Yeah, I just want to get to specifics.
how about the population growth of? No, how about, okay, let's do this one. The motives that the apostles had to write the gospel that got them thrown out of the synagogues, beaten, arrested, tortured, and killed. Why did they
Well, so
fabricate a lie? What was their motive? Why
okay,
did
so
they
but
sit?
what is your source for them being tortured and killed? Well, let's go
Well,
to that one.
there's definitely evidence for all of that. You find tombs, you find,
Okay,
where
what is
grave
the
sites.
evidence for that? Pick one, just one source for this, for the martyrdom, for the proof that somebody died for a lie or whatever, that kind of thing. Where are you getting this from? What's your source for this one specific claim?
Well, these sources that I'm claiming are actually from pagan sources. So the death of the Christians, the slaughtering of the Christians and everything, I'm not even going back to what the Bible says or anything about that. I'm not talking about the martyrdom of Stephen. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions Christians killed under the Roman Empire of Nero. So I
Okay, but
mean, and
what's your
then
source for this? I'm talking about history. You need a source to
the
support your claim.
documents,
So what is your
the
source?
historic.
What's your document?
Do you want me to read you all 15 of
Not
the?
15, just one.
So I mean, I'm kind of, but I'm kind of curious as to what you're doing, because usually
So
whenever
I'm
you
doing
evaluate,
history. This is how
but
historiography
usually
works.
whenever you evaluate truth, you gather all the evidence, not just one. You don't just get one thing. That's what I was saying
Well, no, you have to
previously.
do it one at a time. So I understand that you want to
Right.
address all of it. We don't have, we don't have years to do this. So we want to pick one source and we want to evaluate that one source. And ideally, you want that to be your strongest, because obviously, if your strongest source is weak, then it means all the other ones are weaker than that. So you want to pick your best case.
Well, I mean, you got to kind of think about what you're saying. Like I was telling you previously, was that I'm not saying there's an empty tomb and it's been confirmed. And, because honestly, nobody by DNA knows exactly if that was Jesus' tomb. I'm not saying this is an empty tomb. Archaeologist says this, believe in Jesus. This is this, believe in Jesus. No, I'm saying what all of this gathered together, what all of this information and all of, I mean, there's things that I can tell you. I can tell you the websites. You can research
Yeah, okay,
everything I'm
but
telling.
if I could just interject here. So all the evidence gathered together isn't going to be worth much if none of the evidence is good. So you need to show that one piece of evidence is good. We can evaluate that piece of evidence, and then
No,
we can move to the
showing
next one.
one piece of evidence to be invalid in any way does not disprove all other evidence.
So it does if that's your strongest evidence. That's what I mean. So
No,
you have to
that's not.
start with a heuristic here.
That's
No,
not. That's
no,
not how
seriously,
it
if
works.
your
Because
best
no,
evidence is
listen,
bad,
I'm gonna tell you why
everything
that's.
less than the best is less than the
I'm
best. This
gonna.
is basic logic.
No. I'm gonna tell you why that's wrong. Because you think about whenever you go to a court of law and you're investigating a murder and it's on trial, just because you don't have the murder weapon does not mean you don't have a case. So for you to say, since you don't have the knife, you don't have a case, or we can prove that it wasn't done with the knife, so therefore we can prove that this victim was not murdered, that's fallacious. That's wrong.
So
You have
let me see
to
if
refute
I can explain this with
all.
basic
But
logic for
listen,
you.
but let me finish the statement really quick, and then you can say whatever.
Okay.
Okay, respectfully, um, the entire case would have to be refuted for it to be a mistrial or something like that. You cannot dismiss every piece of evidence and say, if you don't have this, then the rest of your evidence is invalid. Because you could have the murderer, you could have fingerprints, you could have DNA, you could have stained clothing, but you don't have a knife. So therefore you don't have a case. Come on now.
No, so I'm talking about a basic logical principle. So let's say you have a
This
collection of numbers. You don't know where any of the numbers are, but you know they're all between 0 and 2. And you pick your highest number. This is basically how I'm asking, like, give me your highest, give me your best. If we look at the highest number and it's a 2, you're still on solid ground. If we look at the highest number and it's a 1, that's still pretty decent. If you look at the highest number and it's a 0, you've just proven that all the numbers are 0. So I'm saying you need to present your strongest evidence to make
Well,
sure it
man,
actually
look,
holds
I
up.
could apply that claim right back to evolution. If you can't explain how we evolved from molecules to man, then you don't have the strong enough evidence to even prove microevolution. Like, I mean, microevolution is observational science. Like, we can see things adapting to their environment, but that is not evidence for macroevolution, which says that we all came from a pool of things that we say are something, but come to turn out they be nothing. But anyway, as far as that goes, according to that, like that's how we came to be. So, I mean, I really don't see, I mean, how that claim is applicable to me whenever I can really just use it right back on you and say the same thing about your beliefs. Because
Yeah, I
just
mean,
because you
you
can
could absolutely
disprove
use
one
the
thing,
same method. So if you use
right?
my method, for example, let's say I present the strongest piece of evidence for my case to you, and you find that it is like a 0, like we talked about before, and then if that's my strongest evidence, then all the other evidence I have is weaker than the strongest evidence. That's just how logic works. So
No,
I'm
no, no,
asking
no,
you,
no, 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 because you're talking about two different types of logic. You're talking about the either or logic, or you're talking about the and logic. So one of
well,
them
this
is
is
both.
maths. This is greater than, less than. So if you know there's nothing greater than your best, then everything else is less than or equal to, right? This
No,
is basic
because it
maths.
doesn't. It depends on what that person considers the best. Because to
No, I'm talking
you,
about flat logic maths.
but no, I get
You
what you're
can't have a
saying.
debate where you argue that 2 is greater than 3. That's
No,
not how it
no, you
works.
can't.
It's
No,
logical,
you can't.
fundamental
No,
fact.
no, you can't have a debate where you say, okay, take your strongest argument, and then all the evidence you have, close it down to one piece of evidence, and we'll discuss that. And if that, for any way, is inaccurate, then all of your other evidence fails. That's not how it works.
Well, so that's the thing. If it's their strongest evidence, it's a heuristic. So
But
you
okay,
don't
so
have
like
years of time to explore all the evidence in great detail. If a flat earther comes up to
oh
you
no, look,
and
I agree
give
with
you
that.
their best evidence, and their best evidence is weak, you don't even need to look at the rest of their evidence because it's not as
Okay,
good as that
but
first piece of evidence.
tell me what you consider best evidence. Because your best
What the
evidence
best
might
evidence
be
for
the
Jesus
murder
existing?
weapon. Well, listen, your best evidence might be the murder weapon. My best evidence, in my opinion, is the DNA left on the crime scene. So it
Yeah,
doesn't
but you
mean
don't
that
have
just
Jesus's DNA. You're wandering off topic. You've jumped to
no, no, no,
evolution, and
no, I'm
you've gone
not
to
because
murders and
this
crime
is a
scenes.
no. This is normal by comparison. This is how you find truth is by the same basis of court system. Like it's the same laws. It's the same laws of principle. So whether I'm talking about a murder scene or whether I'm talking about historical documents and evidence and everything else, it all intertwines. There's direct evidence and indirect evidence. You can't say just because you don't have the direct evidence, then all the indirect evidence is invalid. Like
Well,
you
you
can't.
can say that if you ask someone for their best evidence and they give you indirect evidence, you know they have no direct evidence, right? That's what I'm saying.
But archaeology is direct evidence.
Absolutely,
So that's what
archaeology
I'm
is
saying. See,
direct evidence.
to you, direct evidence is observational. To me, direct evidence, as far as we're talking about the historical Jesus, to me, my best evidence is myself. It's no longer what I am. I mean, because you cannot just change from one thing to another just overnight by nothing. So I mean, but like I said, your idea of best evidence is different than my idea of best evidence, because whenever I look at somebody that did all kind of horrible things and I see them humble and apologizing, asking for forgiveness and changing their ways, to me, that's evidence of something outside
So
naturalism.
let's say, for example, you were talking to a Muslim and you asked them for evidence of a historical Muhammad, and they said, "My life changed." Would you consider that to be strong evidence?
It would depend. It would depend very much. What is
How
the
would it depend?
amount?
How is that evidence?
What is the amount of people that have? Matter of fact, if I were to ask a Muslim that and they told me that, the next thing I would ask them, then why is it that 3 to 8 million Muslims a year convert to Christianity?
No, I think you're missing the point. So that is not
No, no,
evidence
no, no.
of a
I'm
historical
responding.
Muhammad. It's evidence of someone changing their mind. So that's not how history works. For history, you need to have a source that's ideally close to the actual events. Ideally, you want
Yeah,
an
and the closest,
eyewitness. If not, you want the closest thing you can get to an eyewitness.
right, right. That
So
is
somebody
one
changing their
of the
mind
ways.
isn't evidence of Jesus existing in history.
Right.
That's not how
That
that
is no,
works.
but what you just said, I'm gonna touch on what you just said. One of the best ways to find out, I mean, one of the credible steps you take when evaluating evidence is the time after it was recorded. If you look at all prior historical evidence, I'll send you a chart if you want. I'll post it
I
on
just
Facebook. I'll
want
post it in
one
the
piece of
group.
evidence that your strongest piece of evidence for Jesus. Is it the personal experience thing? Is that your strongest evidence for a historical Jesus?
That's not my argumentative evidence. That is my opinion of what I believe the best evidence is. If I want to see Jesus that the Bible talks about physically and observe it, the way y'all observe things in the natural, we observe things in the spiritual. And we can definitely see when the Spirit of God has touched somebody and changed their life.
Yeah, but we said right at the beginning, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
No,
the
it's not.
physical
But
Jesus on
you
earth, right?
went back to it, so I touched back on it with you. But no, I mean, man, there's so much. Like I mean, I could tune in to every call. We can touch on one topic.
Just
Right
one.
now, it's
Pick
just
one.
a
Just
yeah.
one.
Well, I mean,
What's your
there might
best?
have to be. There might no. See, there you go. We can talk about one thing at a time, one piece of evidence at a time. We can go down all of the 46 sources for Jesus. And you know what? If
I
you can
think other people
refute,
are going to want to call in at some point. So let's just talk about one
oh
for
yeah,
now and
yeah,
see how it
yeah, no
goes.
problem. I'm sure I'll
So
run
which
back
one's
and
your
see,
best?
man. Look, oh yeah, no, see, I would say that my best, like I said, my best is different than your best. My best is outward evidence. But as far as documental evidence, I would say the fact that it's been confirmed that the Bible is 99.5% accurate. But according to you, that 0.5% falsifies the whole entire thing, which historians say is confirmed and verified as historical, authentic documents.
So you want to
So
use the Bible. Which specific source in the Bible? The Bible's a whole compilation of multiple sources. So pick one. Which book of the Bible is your best evidence for Jesus?
I would go with Luke because Luke is a qualified historian, probably the best that's ever lived. So I would definitely go with Luke.
Okay, Luke was written by who?
Luke was written by Luke.
Okay, where does it say that?
Have you done any of the research on that?
Yeah, I've read Luke. It doesn't say it was written by Luke.
Hold on. That's not the only book written by Luke, but I firmly
I
believe it
think
was
you
written by
might be
Luke.
thinking of Acts. Luke and Acts was written by the same anonymous author. Nobody knows who wrote it. The assignation Kata Luke was assigned to it later, around the 180s, by Irenaeus, or at least he reported on that.
You know what?
But we
I
don't
think
actually know who wrote it.
no. I think you're. I know what you're talking about. Okay. All right. Yeah. No. I know what you're touching on right now. Let me see what my source says, just just to see whether it is. Now, I'm not saying how accurate or anything this is. I have I do a lot of digging whenever I find something. I don't just take it for face value.
Yeah, I'm
So
happy to
let me
help you
see.
do a bit of fact checking.
Okay, so let me look up Luke real quick. See, because I'm curious about this now. You got me thinking.
Okay, I mean, for the benefit of the listeners, while you're looking that up, so kata means according to, like the tradition of. It doesn't mean that
Uh huh.
that's the author. So this is the tradition according to Luke, effectively. It's not saying that he wrote it. It's like the name of that body of tradition. So we don't
Okay.
actually know
Okay.
who
Well.
wrote Luke.
Okay, so let me tell you where my source came from real quick, and then I'm gonna give other people a chance to call in, okay? But I do appreciate
Sure.
our conversation, and I'm looking forward to more discussions with you. And maybe, instead of me having this just dump load of stuff, then we'll touch on one thing at a time. But I'm gonna tell you, it's like it felt like a release of information that just came out. So I mean, we did kind of get familiar, a little more familiar with each other. So if we're gonna have future conversations, I don't think that was a bad thing. But basically, the Edison definition or the Edison dictionary is my source for the book of Luke being written. However, he is not claiming to be an eyewitness, which is something I mentioned earlier. He is a secondary source. So, but he is the most accurate. But anyway, I'll let you get to the rest of your cast, and I appreciate you accepting my call, man. Good talking with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I mean, if you feel like calling in later if we have a lull, then we can continue on. But yeah, thanks for joining.
Yeah, absolutely, man. As soon as I
Okay, I'll take the next caller. If this button responds to me clicking it. There we go. Is that Illumio?
Yep. Hey, what's up, Joe?
Right. Thanks for calling in.
Hey. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. The whole discussion is actually a fool's errand. It's sort of a waste of time to even talk about it.
It's not my usual area when discussing this because I tend to address it from a historical point of view. But there are a lot of people who will see this from a faith perspective. So I want to respect that and have that conversation if that's what people want to talk about. So.
Oh yeah. If they wanna debate it, but I mean, like, the whole thing about faith is that it's predicated on having little or not enough evidence. So the less evidence you have, the more faith you need. So it's how do you
hold
even
the position, yeah.
How do you even prosecute that? you know.
The way I would do it is address each piece of evidence one piece at a time and look at the logic of that. And if you have to, break it down to lower levels of logic and potentially use the outsider test for faith. So you take another example where the logic is identical and apply their logic to that, and then see if they do it in a different way than they would if it was something that they have faith in.
This is a problem of framing. Your frame is strong in logic and that, but they live and think outside of that frame. Where they come from, water is a solid, air is a iron is a liquid. It's outside of the frame.
Iron can be a liquid,
you can't use logic. It would be like going down the rabbit hole, the metaphoric rabbit hole, meeting the characters down there and trying to logic your way into friendship with them.
Well, so given the topic of the show, where do you fall on whether Jesus existed, and how would your understanding of faith versus logic impact that?
Yeah, so I'm basically an atheist, but I respect Christians. I respect the institution, but I don't see the point of arguing with them about it because it's
Well,
it's like,
in terms of the existence of a historical Jesus, like where do you fall on that? Have you looked into it, or do you like
historical
listen
Jesus?
to what other
I
people
remember
think?
in high school. In high school, I was sold that Jesus was a historical figure. That I remember that was one of the things they were trying to get across to me. I haven't really seen any evidence of that. The most that I've been able to get to is that there was in fact a guy named Jesus. Whether that was the Jesus or not, don't know. And there was a guy who did a few of the things that was historically done. Not the mythical ones, but like certain wherever the Romans were involved, because the Romans were very, very good at admin. They kept notes on everything.
Well, not everything, but yeah. So you would say that makes you a believer in a historical Jesus.
I see Thomas saying no, but I see Thomas saying no. But I would like to ask Thomas, what do you think are the chances that there was no one in the entire world named Jesus up until
that's not what we're talking about, though. I mean, that Jesus was a very common name. It was actually Joshua, and there were tons of Joshuas around. It's the same thing. So that's not what we were talking about, though. We would talk about, was there a guy called Jesus who founded Christianity, like who was the inspiration for the biblical Jesus, regardless of the actual miracle stuff?
I'm guessing that there probably was, although probably things didn't play out like in the Bible. But I'm guessing that that loosely there probably was some a figure like that. I mean, I don't think Christianity just came out of nowhere.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, so nobody thinks Christianity came out of nowhere because that's not really relevant either way because Christianity exists in either hypothesis. So you have to have an example of a case like where Jesus does exist and where doesn't exist, and both of those have to end at the same end of the game. Basically, you have to have
well, I
the
guess
end result
because
is the
I don't
Bible.
have the papers in front of me, and I couldn't care enough to go look for it.
I mean, that's fair enough. If it doesn't really bother you, then it's not the kind
No,
of thing you need to
knowing that
investigate.
Jesus was real or not will make zero difference in my life.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So you basically just sit with a consensus position from the perspective that you're not interested enough to go and check for yourself, right? That's kind of where you're sitting.
I can't see what kind of a difference it would make in my life to know or not to know. Um,
Yeah, you're right. It's purely an academic question, isn't it? It's something for historians to argue over.
I'm sure it make a huge difference for Christians and for Jews and for Muslims, since they share in that mythology. But
Well, it doesn't really affect them because they don't believe in the historical Jesus either. They believe
no,
in the
they
divine
believe
Jesus.
no, they believe in Jesus. Jesus was a prophet for them. He wasn't a
Yeah,
very
but
important prophet,
so
but he was a prophet.
Yeah, but as we pointed out, the historical Jesus is not the same as the divine Jesus. So if they believe in Jesus as a magical being, they're also not talking about the same
Oh
thing.
no, no, I don't want to go into that divine stuff. I'm just going by
Yeah,
what's like what's
it's
written
three
in
different
text.
positions.
Based on what's
So
written in text, there's three religions, and they all reference Jesus, some more than others, and they all have their origin in the Hebrew in the God of David, of which Jesus is undoubtedly a part of. So
yeah, the Abrahamic faiths
yeah,
effectively.
the
So
Abrahamic
I'm
faith, yeah.
talking about there's three different Jesuses. There's the historical Jesus, there's the divine Jesus, and then there's the myth Jesus. And what I do is I take the
Okay, can
divine
you hold on
Jesus
one second? I
out.
got a phone call. Just 1 second, please.
Okay, I mean we could take another caller if you want to drop
Okay,
out.
I'll drop by that.
Okay, feel free to call back though. I'll take the next caller. Hello, Dave again.
Hello,
You're currently on mute.
I'm
Hello,
back
I got you.
very briefly. Um, so, I wanted to bring up a point about the process again that you were talking about with Daniel, right? Because I object to this point very strongly. This idea that give me your best evidence, and then if we can show that that's bad, then that tells us something about the body of evidence. That's not correct, right?
What do you mean if he's wrong about it being the best? Or,
No,
I
I
mean,
just
where are you
mean that
going with that?
what I mean is that it's not the case that, I mean, of course, that we don't have an infinite amount of time, right? But it's evidence is cumulative, um, and if you can show a bunch of, like some people have this line like the plural of bullshit isn't data or something like that. But the plural of circumstantial can and often is very persuasive. So if every
Yeah,
individual
definitely.
piece of evidence isn't very persuasive on its own, that doesn't tell you anything about the body of
Well, no,
evidence
I addressed
necessarily.
that as well in my examples. So I said, well, when I was talking about like a 2 and a 1 and a 0, I said if your best is a 2 or your best is a 1, you've still got a good case. So if your best is solid evidence or circumstantial evidence, but if your best evidence is not evidence, then you have 0 across the board. That's the point I was trying to make, and I was trying to make it very simple, because he wouldn't give me even a single piece of evidence, which is quite frustrating. So we couldn't address anything in detail. We could only address general trends and sort of wishy-washy ideas, and that's not very helpful because when you're talking about history, you need to get down to the detail. You need to get down to the facts. So talking about general trends is not great. You got to go actually nail them down first, piece by piece, to get to evidence. So do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that sounds right. Um, if you got,
Yeah,
but
so sorry,
yeah,
I agree. Evidence is cumulative, and my point wasn't that if you can debunk one piece of evidence, it debunks all of them. My point is to steel man rather than straw man, and to say if your strongest evidence is not strong, then all you have is weak evidence.
But so the way that you put it there doesn't sounds wrong too, right? If I agree that if your strongest evidence isn't evidence at all, then
Yeah,
obviously
exactly.
that's the same as saying that you have no evidence. But if your strongest evidence is weak evidence, you can still have a very convincing case, provided there's enough of it.
Yeah, and you can generally sort of gather that together. You have to consider contrary evidence as well, evidence to contrary position.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was giving, for example, like a flat Earth argument. If you use heuristics on that, you find their best evidence, and it's a flat Earth argument. We're like, well, we don't need to go any further, do we? Because you've already shown that you don't understand how evidence works. So the rest of your evidence is going to be terrible. It's one reason it's good to vet ideas by making sure that it's actually based on scholarship, because the whole point of
Sure.
scholarship is to remove bias, focus on sound methodology. So if people's evidence doesn't arrive via that route, then it's a little bit less helpful. Sometimes it's still solid, but that again is another heuristic. You're just trying to whittle down to the best case that someone can give. They're trying to steelman the argument effectively.
Sure. Okay. That sounds okay then. As long as we're on the same page about, because I do think there's a bunch of circumstantial bits of evidence, perhaps. I don't know what they accumulate to, because we've talked a couple of times, and I don't know nearly as much about this subject matter as you do. And
Yeah, I could list a few for you if you wanted to look at that. So there's a mention in Paul of a brother of the Lord. So that could potentially mean like a biological brother rather than a cult brother. I mean,
mhm,
Paul calls all of them brothers, but that's still, at least he's specifying the Lord there. So if you take the Lord to mean like the physical Jesus rather than the Lord Jesus, then you could potentially use that as argument. Or you could take the Gospels and you could just say, well, the Gospels must have gone back to an eyewitness source at some point. So you could try and argue that way around.
yeah,
There's a bit when Paul mentions Jesus being of the sperm of David. So you could argue that, not obviously that he's literally David's son, but you could say that means like descent from David or something like that. So some
yeah.
sort
Is
of
that
hierarchy
is
or
that in Romans
lineage.
1?
Romans 1:3, is it? I'm trying to
Yeah,
remember all these things off the top of my head.
it's right at the beginning, right when he's introducing himself to the church in Rome. He says something along the
Yeah.
lines of Jesus, who was, at least in his fleshly manner or whatever, was descended from David.
Yeah, so that's the English translation, a descendant of David. I mean, in the
Yeah.
Greek, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but yeah, so you could say that that's a piece of circumstantial evidence that you could try and use to argue for Jesus. So, and I would agree, you can build a case using pieces, because literally all we have is circumstantial. There's no solid evidence for Jesus.
Yep. Okay. Because that does sound to me like he's talking about. I mean, he's talking about sperm and whatnot, and his earthly half versus his heavenly. I mean, that
Well,
does
that
kind
that
of
can
sound
mean
like
it can mean descendants. Yeah.
descendant of. Or you said the Greek is more ambiguous. Is it translated differently in the Greek?
Yeah, so he says he is created from the sperm of David, which, given Christian beliefs, especially if you look at the Virgin Mary story, he could mean it
Uh-huh.
literally, because that would be like a more direct way of fulfilling it. And also, the reason for saying this, so even if there was a historical Jesus, the odds are he wasn't actually a descendant of David. The odds are that this is based on prophecy rather than real history.
Sure.
Because if it was real, they would have actually cited a proper genealogy for him, wouldn't they? But that doesn't seem to be the
Probably.
case here. That looks like it was invented later, especially because Matthew and Luke both give contradictory genealogies. So it's not great as
Yeah. So
evidence.
I guess I'm just wondering. So we talked last time, right? And one of the questions I had for you was like, what am I getting for the mythicist hypothesis that I don't get on the standard view of things? And one of the ideas that you'd presented was this idea that Paul doesn't really talk about the historical Jesus, I thought, or he doesn't talk about the physical worldly Jesus. But of course, in that passage, that does sound to me like he's talking about a physical worldly Jesus. I'm just wondering, like, what do you expect him to say? I mean, because if he's talking about how Jesus, what line of sperm he came from, that sounds like a historical figure, or at least Paul thinks so. And I'm
Well,
just wondering
so
what
the
you
thing
expect him to
is,
say.
Yeah, so if you look at the context, the way Paul treats Jesus is as a visionary heavenly being. Even Bart Ehrman agrees with this now, since his How Jesus Became God book.
Uh-huh.
So he treats Jesus as like a pre-existent archangel type being who is then placed in a human body based on prophecy. He
Mhm.
says it specifically according to the scriptures. And then that body is killed. So having a physical human Jesus isn't quite enough to get past this point, because they believed that the heavens and all of space basically was a physical location, and that's where these angels and demons lived. So a physical body for Jesus still fits with mythicism and historicity. It would have to be like a historical guy on Earth walking around talking to people. That's what we're talking about for historicity. Um, so this is kind of ambiguous. It could mean descendant. It could mean literally what it says. So you need something like Jesus high-fived Peter or something. It's some sort of physical Jesus on Earth. Meeting people, talking to people. Uh, like most people's narratives, when you talk about Jesus, in their head they see a bearded white guy who goes around
Yeah.
preaching to people and healing people. And if you wanted to have a historical Jesus healing people, you could do the faith healer thing, like the psychological tricks. So you could still fit that into history. And that's what we're missing from Paul. That's what we would want to have ideally in Paul. We'd want to have that physical guy walking on Earth.
Ideally, yes, but the part about it being good evidence for mythicism uh, isn't just that it's missing the best confirmation of historicism, right? The idea is should be something like we would expect Paul to have said this, given that he thought that Jesus was a historical figure, or that Jesus was a historical figure. I mean, I guess the most we can show is that he thought that Jesus was a historical figure, and he doesn't say this. So it's weird if he unless he had the mythicist conception of Jesus that you are propounding here. But now it just kind
Yeah,
of
and,
seems
and
like
weird means improbable, which means you're talking about probability there and
right.
saying that it's
That's
more likely on mythicism. That's what
so it's an
weird on
argument.
historicity means. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an argument, and I don't mean this like in like the. I just it's an argument from silence, which depends on how strongly you should expect to see the thing that's missing. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know how you could get around this for historicity. I guess maybe say Paul wasn't that interested in Jesus, which doesn't seem like a great argument to me. People have tried various apologetics to get around it. Probably one of the best ones I've seen is the idea that Paul is trying not to bring up a historical Jesus, because then that would be an argument against Paul's validity. Like the idea that everyone else in the cult had met Jesus except Paul, and Paul's trying not to bring that up. I don't think it's very probable because it's kind of an ad hoc excuse and there's no evidence of it. But I think that would probably be one way you could get around that.
Well, I'm wondering what there is to get around, I guess, is my question, because I would expect, because really what we have from Paul are letters to different churches, right? The Romans, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it's primarily letters to different churches, right? The Christian church in Rome, the Christian church in Ephesus, the
Yeah, you're
et
right.
cetera, et cetera.
It's basically places that he either has traveled or other apostles have traveled to, set up churches, and then he's trying to keep the money flowing in. He's trying to keep them going, keep them cohesive, settle disagreements among them,
Yeah.
clarify elements either from scripture or from the visions to try and solidify the church's message effectively.
So I guess, like when I read Romans and I'm thinking Paul's writing a letter to the church in Rome to help them, set stuff up or settle some disagreements. And he says in that letter, he talks about Jesus in the beginning, talks about his earthly heritage, talks about the fact that he was killed. I'm not like sitting here wondering, why didn't Paul talk about Jesus? And it just kind of seems like, what else is he gonna? Like you said, I mean, I know this is kind of a joking example, but like he high-fived Peter. I mean, I don't see why. What more would he have to bring up to the church in Rome other than the theologically significant points, which is something like he lived here, he died for our sins, whatever.
I mean,
Or
if he said he lived here, that would be a really good example of historicity, but unfortunately, it's not
but
there.
but he did talk about his earthly sperm heritage, right? His sperm, like the. I mean, it just seems like this isn't like
So what he's
Paul
doing
didn't
there is
mention him.
theological. the point is the Messiah has to be descended from David, according to the the perceived prophecies about him.
Yeah.
So even if Jesus was historical, that's still not great because all he's doing is just cementing his validity as a Messiah.
But he's saying that he was descended from David, right? I mean, because that would imply that he's a physical person. Like you said, the Messiah has to be descended from David. Of course, that means the Messiah has to be a physical person. So what Paul's asserting here when he says Jesus was descended
Also,
from
the reason
David
he
is
was
he's saying he's a
physical,
physical person.
yeah, the reason he's saying he was physical is because he has to be killed. In order to be killed, obviously divine beings couldn't be killed. You had to become mortal. And the way that they got around this was very similar to the other demigods stories. They had a mortal body for the god, and then they killed that body, and then he had to be resurrected from that. So that fits perfectly with mythicism, and it fits more importantly in the context of the time, because this was pretty much typical of the understanding that you have to take on a mortal body to die. It's what he means when he says he's under the law. He becomes mortal.
Yeah, it does. It does fit with myth. I can understand how you could read that from a mythicist perspective and not be too troubled with what you read. But I also think that this whole argument from Paul's silence kind of hinges on the fact that Paul wasn't saying things, and it's really surprising when I see him when I read that. It sounds like he's saying Jesus was a descendant of David, and
Yeah,
now it
because
just kind of
you're
seems
reading
like
it
we're disagreeing
having read the
over.
Gospels first, so you've got the Gospels in mind, or at least the Gospel story in mind, as you read Paul. And this is the difference between the way that people on average tend to read something and the way like a historian would read something. Because if you read the Bible in sequence, like date
Mhm.
order, then you haven't got the Gospels in your head while you're reading Paul.
Sure,
And that's the way that historians tend to read this stuff. They read it in its own context for its own message.
but um, I don't know what about saying he's a descendant of David requires me to have read. Maybe I should have read the Old Testament so that I know that the Messiah is supposed to be descended from David. But I feel
Well,
like
you already know, even the story about the virgin birth of Mary and so on, that's obviously not historical, but that fits mythicism as well, because that's
it
clearly
does.
a magical event, you know.
Yeah.
So he's not saying he's
Um,
literally descended from David. He's saying that there was a magical sperm event, which we know even later Christians still believed. And you can fit this with the story of Zoroaster. So the successor to Zoroaster, the the leader of Zoroastrianism, the founder of it, is that there is sperm in a lake which is stored for the future, and his that a woman will be impregnated by this lake, and that then the successor to Zoroaster will be born. This is typical
yeah,
of
but
ancient religions.
I mean, of course, Paul obviously has a divine conception of Jesus too. So like, if he told the story of the virgin birth, obviously he's talking about some kind of magical sperm event. But the virgin birth is a story about like a physical birth. Like it's a story about a historical figure being born magically. This divine.
Yeah, it's a story based on a mistranslation of Isaiah, is where Matthew got it.
Yeah.
So again, it's not historical in either way. So it
No, it's
really
not.
doesn't help.
But the
So it's a
point
bit of
that
a
I'm
wash.
trying to make is that you know I'm not sure if I'm being very clear or not, but like it wouldn't be a good response to sit like, if Paul told this story and I'm saying, hey, look, he's telling the story of the virgin birth, and he believes it, like unless he's if assume he believes what he's saying, right? He believes the story about the virgin birth. I mean, that's good enough to show me that Paul thought Jesus was a historical figure. Yes, it's theological. Yes, it's based on a misinterpretation, assuming he didn't make it up himself. But like, it does seem like he's talking about a historical figure. And I'm saying similarly when he says Jesus was born from the line of David or something. I mean, obviously there's a reason for that theologically, but that does imply the Messiah is a physical person. So if he's saying he's the Messiah, he's saying he's a physical person. And when he says he got killed, he's implying that there was a physical person that got killed. And that to me sounds like the clearest, most direct reading of that is he's talking about a guy on Earth who got killed. And
Well, I mean,
if the
fictional
argument is
characters can
supposed to,
get killed too, but the point is that we're talking about where this took place. So angels can also die, demigods can die, and there's plenty of precedents for this, plenty of demigod story dying. The question is whether this particular demigod existed in history unlike all the others. Is he like the one exception to this rule, or is he just like all the others? So you have a low precedent already for demigods actually existing, and you're trying to get Jesus above this bar, and so you need some evidence to support your case, but you're stuck at that low ground. You don't really have anything better than circumstantial evidence.
Well, I think that what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that you have a good case to make for mythicism when you say, listen, Paul, it's really surprising that he wrote all this stuff about Jesus and that he never talked about a historical Jesus. And I'm thinking like, well, what would I expect him to write if Jesus was historical? Because that would determine how good your argument is. And then
How about the
I'm
Gospel of Mark?
Hmm?
How about if he wrote something like the Gospel of Mark?
Well,
if you put Jesus on Earth talking to people, actually being a historical guy, what if, for example, Paul said he was killed by Pontius Pilate? Would that be good evidence?
I think it would be better than it would be better for sure. I mean, that would be a better,
Yeah. So the
clearer
fact that he
indication.
doesn't say that must mean that the evidence is weaker than if he did say that. Because obviously,
It's weaker than if he said that,
evidence
yeah.
with that moves it in that direction, then lacking that is going in the other direction, isn't it?
Certainly.
Otherwise,
But
it would be confirmation bias, only taking evidence in one direction and ignoring it in the other direction.
no, I know, but it has to be better evidence for mythicism than it is for historicism, right?
Why?
It can't just be, well, because if it still fits really, really well on historicism, and it fits kind of well on mythicism, then it's not evidence for mythicism, Paul's silence. And I'm saying that from what we have from Paul,
Right.
in
I mean,
Romans
so
at
you
least,
didn't mean it has to be better. You just mean it has to lean towards mythicism rather than historicity.
um, that's what I meant by better. Yeah, like
Yeah.
it should
Okay.
point towards one of these two hypotheses, and it seemed like the evidence that you were giving me for mythicism is that Paul, um, like
Yeah.
Paul
It's
never said anything
100%
about the.
expected on mythicism. So you've got a 100% chance that on mythicism, before Jesus is placed in history, there's no mentions of him in history. So that's a perfect fit for mythicism.
Well, why though? Because I feel like you were saying a minute ago, like it's very easy to tell a story about a fictional character on Earth that never existed. So even on mythicism, I wouldn't be surprised if he were woven into history. I mean, I feel like I could read that
Well,
a mythicist
so he
account
was
or on
woven
a.
into history. The point is the dating of it. So obviously, it's the further away you get, the more likely it is that either a historical or a non-historical Jesus could have been placed into history, which is why we're trying to go for like early sources.
Mhm.
Because if you have the cult start with a non-historicized figure and then he's historicized later, that's a little bit easier. And it leaves time for a real guy to also be mythicized. So there is kind of a cutoff date for the evidence. So we want to go earliest evidence. Does that earliest evidence show a historical guy or not? It doesn't. So
But you're
that
saying
clearly
that
favors
this.
his mythicism over historicity.
But you're saying that the earliest evidence is a mythicist account. So he's
Yeah,
been
Paul's
mythologized, right?
source.
And I'm just saying, if he's already been conceived in the minds of these conspirators as this fictional entity, I
Wait,
don't see
what
why it would be
conspirators?
surprising. Well, the people who are making him up, whoever's inventing Jesus as a cult leader, or Peter
I
or
suppose you
Paul,
could
or
call it cult a conspiracy. The problem is I don't think of it as a conspiracy because they're all like earnest believers and they all believe this stuff. I don't see them like conspiring. That suggests that they know it's fiction.
you
Whereas
think
Paul believed in
uh,
Jesus.
uh, perhaps he did, but what you are saying is that somebody's made it up before this point, even if this is the earliest evidence. And that what I'm saying is, well, if somebody's already made it up, it's very easy to imagine that he would tell a historical account and say, "No, listen, like the son of Zeus was here. He killed 100 Romans and he, broke the skull of a lion or something." You could tell a story like that. It's not. I mean, I don't think that it's just it's 100% predicted on mythicism that there'd be no mention like that. I mean, it just seems kind of this seems kind of fishy to me, right? Because you're saying it's really weird that Paul never talks about the historical Jesus. But actually, we
No,
go read
so
Romans.
I specified before he was historicized. So it's 100% expected that before he's placed into history that he's not mentioned as being in history. That's what I said.
Well, okay, but that's, I mean, I feel like that's true by definition. um, what do you really say? Of course, before he was placed into history, he hadn't been placed into history yet. But
Yeah,
I don't.
a lot of my points are basically tautologies, and it's just a way of just checking that people are listening to me and they can understand the rhetoric. And you know, you get what I mean. Sometimes I have to state
Okay,
things like when I was
that's
talking
fine.
to Daniel earlier, and I was trying to make the point that mathematics is mathematics, and you can't really argue against the logic of that. And he
Sure,
still disagreed. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to derail you
that's
there.
okay. I just so let me tell you where I'm coming from. Because I was wondering, like what doesn't fit with historicity, and I thought the idea was something like Paul's bizarre silence about the historicity. She doesn't talk about him at all. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. Is that like true that he never talks about Jesus being on earth like in a way that is like reasonably expected? But it just turns out that in Romans he talks about what sperm he came from and the fact that he was killed. And now it's not so much that he never talked about the historical Jesus. What it is that you're reading that as like he's talking about this in the fictional realm with like in space or something with uh how the demigods are killed in space or something, which is possible. But it's
Yeah,
also
it
just
fits within the
possible that he's
context
just,
of the time.
yeah. But it's also just possible that he's talking about the historical Jesus, and so it's not actually the case that he has this weird silence. It's just I feel like that argument doesn't work if he's talking about sperm lines and
Well,
his
no, we
death
already
and
addressed that because if he'd mentioned Pilate, that would be better evidence for historicity than not mentioning Pilate. So there's an example where you would expect him to say something about that, and you know, it's an event that was so important that they
well,
added it to the creed later on. Like it's a central part of the Christian creed to mention Pilate. That's really weird, but apparently wasn't important to Paul because I
but
guess it didn't happen or what.
But look, if he wrote an entire extra gospel like Mark, which was completely focused on establishing the historicity, and it started off by saying Jesus was a historical figure. He was born in this city block at this time of night on this particular day. This was the name of the ruler. Like that would be better evidence for historicity too. But just because that isn't there, that doesn't give you good evidence for mythicism. Just because it's not the best evidence for historicity, and like this isn't really a counterpoint. You're just saying that the evidence could be better, and I agree the evidence could be better. But I feel like Paul talks about the historical Jesus. He's just writing to a church to settle some disputes in Rome, and I feel like talking about the general fact that Jesus was the Messiah and that he was killed is probably all you would really expect to see. I mean, I
Yeah,
wouldn't
and
expect
if you
him to.
wanted to argue that, say, people shouldn't get married or should get married, you'd mention Jesus' marital status. Obviously, as the most important character in the entire cult, his life should be absolutely central to the teachings of the rest of the cult. But it's not.
Um,
That's weird, and you would have to explain that away.
well, I'm not so sure that it is. I mean, I would agree that it was weird if he never made reference to Jesus at all, but like you keep
No,
bringing up
I'm
these
not saying
things
he
about
never made a
you're,
reference to Jesus. I'm saying he never made
uh,
a reference to a historical Jesus on Earth. That's the
but a
thing we're
historical
debating.
Jesus means a physical person that we're talking about when we say Jesus.
Yeah, but when you say physical, that fits both Jesuses in both cases, because to the ancient people, the context in which we're talking about here, he was a physical Jesus in both cases. So you need an actual
What do you mean
historical
both
Jesus on
cases?
Earth.
How is he a physical Jesus if you're saying it's a myth about a physical person?
Yeah. So to them, all the gods were physical beings. Space was physical. The heavens were physical. There were all this stuff about heaven being in another dimension and ethereal and spiritual. That didn't exist back in those times. It was all physical to them. So just saying a physical human Jesus isn't enough because that matches mythicism perfectly.
But then every reference to Jesus being a historical figure would match mythicism perfectly. I mean, if you're gonna
No, not
say,
if he was on Earth. That's why I specified on Earth. Okay, that's the context here coming in. So you need to read these in the context of first century Judaism, their beliefs about cosmology, That this is the point of reading things in the original context, that you don't import your 2,000 year later assumptions into their original context. You need to read it like a historian would.
But what do you think "born of a particular human line" means? Like born of this genealogy, he was in this
Well, it
particular
doesn't actually say
genealogical line.
born, so it doesn't use the word that Paul uses for human birth. It uses the word he uses for the creation of Adam, and the word he uses for the creation of the resurrection bodies. So it's Paul actually avoiding the word born. That's something that Bart Ehrman discovered, and we actually have a record of Christians trying to change it into the word that Paul uses for born. So they felt bad about this verse somehow, and they were trying to change it, which is quite an interesting thing in itself.
Okay, but I mean, I can understand how you could read it a different way, and that's not what I'm saying. I don't understand how you can say that there's no plausible reference to Jesus being a guy walking around on Earth if he's
I'm
talking
saying
about a particular human
at
line.
best it's ambiguous. He doesn't place it on Earth, so you can look at that piece where he says he's made of the sperm of David, and you can go, that could be a historical Jesus. It might not be a historical Jesus. It's ambiguous. It's not great either way. So we're going to need something better than that.
Well, I mean, you mean it could be a physical Jesus on Earth? Not, I mean, obviously, we agree that this
When I
this is
say
probably not
historical
true.
Jesus, I'm talking about the guy on Earth, because the mythical Jesus is still physical. So I'm trying to specify which one.
Okay, I mean, maybe we can just put this down because I feel like we're just going to start going in circles. I mean, I just kind of think it's a bit weird. I feel like you're taking kind of with at least some of these, um, it's kind of a questionable reading of what to me seems like a very direct reference to just a physical human genealogy. It's like I mean, the Messiah, he's asserting that Jesus was the Messiah. We agree that that's the point of the theological point of saying that. And the Messiah
Yep.
is a physical person.
Yeah,
Is
and the
an
Messiah,
actual.
if being a physical person fits mythicism and fits historicity. That's why I'm talking about understanding this in its original context, because you might make false assumptions if you're just reading the English and you're reading it in the 21st century context. Then you might make mistakes about what they believed back then. We have to remember that they didn't understand, they haven't seen pictures from NASA. They had a completely different cosmology than we did. They thought the Earth was flat, for example. So you have to
But
take
the
that
Jews
into
were
account when you're
expecting
trying to read this.
sure, but the Jews were expecting a physical person Messiah. Like famously, they expected a person. Like they
Yeah,
didn't
they were
expect
expecting
like
a
a
dying
god that was
Messiah.
never on Earth, right? They expected like a physical person showing up and walking around and doing whatever the Messiah does in Judea. And when Paul says, "Hey, this guy was the Messiah," which is why he's reading him into that line. I mean, I just don't see how you're getting around this idea that he's talking about the Messiah, which is a physical person. I mean, if I read in what they were expecting about the Messiah, and then Paul says this was the Messiah, it seems like Paul's saying this was a guy.
Yeah, but you would have to agree, right, that Paul thinks Jesus is a god who existed before he took on a human body.
Yeah, I think everybody, well, not everybody, but he thought that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the context we're talking about. He believes that he was a pre-existent being, took on a body of flesh, and was then killed. So that fits both scenarios. So what you need to do is place this body of flesh in a childhood, growing up, living in places, having a job or whatever, going on his ministry, teaching, doing miracles, having followers, disciples, for example. All of this is missing, and it's a big gaping hole in Paul, and you need to do something about that. You can't just ignore it. Ignoring evidence against your position would be fallacious, right?
I mean, this is another thing. We're going to disagree on your when you call things fallacious, but it's not good to ignore evidence against your position, certainly. What I'm saying is that when Paul is writing about the disputes about marriage in Rome, I don't expect him to go on a tangent about Jesus' childhood. And so it's not good evidence against historicism that
Well,
those types
not
of
his
things aren't there.
childhood, but how about Jesus' marital status? Would that not be relevant? Does Paul not
I'm not
think
sure that
Jesus
it
is an
would,
important person?
because Jesus is presented as not having a marital status. But
Is he?
obviously, human beings. I mean, when I read it, whatever I've read, it doesn't seem like Jesus has a wife. I mean, maybe some
Well,
people think
so
that Magdalene was
from
his
Paul's perspective,
paramour.
the church is Jesus' wife. But that's obviously a theological thing. But he doesn't mention like a physical Jesus on earth, either having a wife or not having a wife. That doesn't even enter into his mind as relevant as far as we can tell. So when Paul doesn't even hint at the possibility of Jesus being on earth, what are we supposed to do with that? Do we just assume he was on earth anyway and Paul was somehow insane not to mention
So
this?
that's the bit that I'm resisting, because I feel like when he says he's the Messiah, if you read that into the Jewish context, the Jewish people thought the Messiah was on earth. So when he says he's the Messiah, he's at least hinting that he was on earth, because
Well,
that's
how
what the
do you
Jewish
know that
people.
the Jewish people thought the Messiah was on earth?
I'm well, I mean, this is just kind of based on background knowledge. I thought it was very, very well established that the Jewish people were waiting for an actual physical person to show up and be the Messiah, and that they are still actually today, or that there are many messianic figures. I mean, this is the Jewish tradition, and it has been for thousands of years, that there's going to be a physical Messiah. And back then, I think they were expecting some kind of revolt against the Romans or something. I don't know if that's
Yeah,
true or not, but
so most Jews were, but then Christians weren't normal Jews, were they? They didn't have a military Messiah. They had a dying and rising Messiah.
he's reading this into the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament, and that Messiah was supposed to be physical.
Yeah, and
It's
he
at
is a
least a
physical
hint.
Messiah.
It's at least.
It's
I mean, how are you saying he's not even hinting at the physical Messiah? To me, that just
what?
seems
No,
like you're
I'm saying
ignoring
he
a
is a
very
physical Messiah.
plausible.
He
Well,
is a
but
physical
the
Messiah in both
okay,
cases.
but now, okay, but I'm not saying like physical in space. The Messiah was supposed to be on Earth according to the Jewish understanding. I'm reading it. I'm doing what you said, right?
Yeah, so
I'm
you're saying
thinking
earthly
about
Messiah, right?
earthly Messiah being, yeah. I'm saying
Yeah,
the
and I
Messiah is
agree. The
supposed to be
majority of
earthly.
Jews were thinking of an earthly Messiah, and
Yeah.
the Christians ended up without an earthly Messiah. So you then have to say, was there an earthly Messiah which then somehow transitioned to a non-earthly Messiah, or was it always not an earthly Messiah?
But if I'm thinking about if the Messiah was earthly versus if the Messiah was non-earthly and then transitioning into a Messiah, um, I feel like it's fine for Paul to say, talking about the Messiah born of David, that was supposed to be earthly. I would expect him to say that on historicism, and on mythicism, it just seems a little bit. I mean, is Paul? So on your theory, is Paul asserting? Is he presenting Jesus as historical, or is his idea to present Jesus as mythical? Because which
So he's not too explicit about that. He does talk about the mysteries quite a lot. But no, his Jesus is mythical. He's a physical, dying and rising Jesus. The problem is he wasn't a historical guy. He was an angelic spirit that inhabited a body and then had that body killed and then raised from the dead. That was like, the perfect sacrifice idea, which removed the temple.
Mhm.
I mean, Hebrews is pretty explicit about how all of that is like a layout of how to create a religion. So that pretty much shows what Paul had in mind. Hebrews is very similar in that it has only a celestial Messiah, not an earthly one.
Sure. Um, I don't know. Maybe we can just. I feel like maybe we can just kind of table this, because I kind of feel like I'm going to keep saying the same thing, and I think you will too. And I'm just not sure if we're going to make any more progress on this line. So I'll just drop it. I guess I'll just put it down.
Yeah, well, I mean, what would Paul have to have said in order for you to think that he was talking about a non-earthly Jesus?
Well, I'm thinking about it still in the context of how strong the argument from silence is, the argument from Paul's silence, and how well that fits with mythicism. Because if there's a lot missing from Paul that I really would expect to see, then I think it's a much better argument for mythicism than if the kinds of things that are missing from Paul are things that I'm not particularly expecting to see, like a account of his childhood. Like, it's of no relevance that that's missing. I kind of like what I'm expecting to see is brothers in Rome, following our Lord Jesus, who, died, and the Messiah, blah blah blah. Like, it feels like it's a wash. I feel like it's a push. It's not clear. I mean, I feel like if you're expecting to see him mention the historical Jesus, that's pretty. It's like you're saying there's no hint of it, and I'm thinking like there's definitely a hint of it. It sounds like he's talking about the historical Jesus. Maybe he's not, but it's not utter silence, and so.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is every time you do that, I keep pointing out that you're taking it out of context. So it's not as if I'm just naysaying. I'm talking about the actual evidence from history and the original context of Judaism.
How am I taking it out of context? Because the reason that I'm thinking, I'm thinking about.
Well, for example,
not.
when you mixed up physical with earthly, like that was an example of not fitting in the context, and we addressed that and you corrected it, but you approached it originally from that perspective. So has discovering that context changed your opinion? Like, are you leaning more towards mythicism than you were before you knew that?
I'm not. So I'm leaning more towards mythicism, in the sense that maybe in some of Paul's other letters he doesn't talk very much about Jesus, or when you brought up this point originally the last time we talked, right, and you said like Paul's references to the historical Jesus are incredibly scanty given what we'd expect for how much he's written about him. And I thought like, oh yeah, that's a substantive point to put on the scales here in favor of mythicism. So I definitely take that. And what I'm saying now is, how well does that square with this passage in Romans, at least in Romans, because I think that the physical and earthly thing is something that was just a linguistic thing, because when I say earthly or physical, I'm reading in the context of what the Messiah was supposed to be, and he was asserting Jesus as the Messiah, and that sounds to me like he's asserting a physical person. So when I say that he's making a reference here, I'm thinking about the context of the Messiah and what Paul is literally saying about his bloodline and that he's the Messiah, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that Christianity was just a normal Jewish cult that did normal Jewish things. They were a Jewish cult, and Judaism was incredibly diverse, especially around the first century. And I wouldn't disagree that the majority of Messiah cults were following an actual guy who claimed to be a Messiah, but they all failed.
hmm
So the one that succeeded, the one that made it into the Roman Empire and then spread to the rest of the world, was the one that overcame that hurdle. It made it past that difficulty by having a Messiah that couldn't actually be killed on Earth because he wasn't on Earth. He was a celestial Messiah. And that's regardless of whether he started as a historical guy or not. Christianity ended up with a celestial Messiah.
I guess I'm just wondering, like, so obviously, so I agree. Like, it's definitely possible that I'm not saying this is good evidence necessarily. I mean, I guess it has to be in some sense, but it's not like a killer knockdown blow to mythicism. Like, you can read it into mythicism. It's just not clear that I'd want to do that, given. I mean, maybe it's like you said. Like, maybe I'm just not as well read on the context or something like that. But if it comes down to reading in one context, like the context you just presented, or reading in just like oh, he's just talking about the Messiah and that's what they believe, it becomes so much less clear to me what to think about this idea that Paul is not talking about Jesus than it was before. You see what I'm saying? Like I didn't say that very
Yeah,
well.
and
But
there's no reason to make any snap judgments. You can turn it over in your head and do additional research because this is all stuff that we want to do. We want to make sure we bounce ideas off each other, make sure we've got the strongest argument, watch out for mistakes, and just pick up new information as we learn it. So it's
so
all
why
good.
do you
But
think that? Because I'm just gonna move. I'm just gonna forget. So I think we can forget about that now. I think we've kind of discussed that ad nauseum. But so why do you think that? Honest question. Like, why do you think that the consensus is so solidly in favor of of the historicity view? I mean, I'm aware of course, Carrier and Price and some of these guys that kind of advance a more mythicist hypothesis. But as someone who's kind of a layman, and like I said at the beginning, like, I'm probably never going to know as much about the historical sources and all that as you do. Um, so as someone who's not going to do extensive work on this idea, it's kind of weird. It feels almost intellectually irresponsible for me to adopt a view that the scholarly consensus uh, is so motivated against. I mean, it's such a wide consensus. Why do you think that that consensus exists? Is my question.
yeah, I mean, and I respect that. That just like moving towards agnosticism is good enough for me, because obviously, unless you're going to study it in detail yourself, then you should hold a tentative position, and that's perfectly fair. Obviously, there are a few reasons why the majority of scholars believe in Jesus, in a historical sense. First is the majority of scholars are Christians on this, so I mean they're already restricted by faith. Another is the majority of biblical institutions in sort of Western countries, particularly in America, are funded by Christians, run by Christians, and actually the majority or the majority of religiously aligned institutions, which is actually the majority of the ones that cover biblical studies, actually require a statement of faith. And you cannot trust the conclusion of anyone who is literally bound by a statement of faith is that they'll lose their job if they go against that statement. And this is some research that
Sure.
David Fitzgerald did for his book Mything in Action, Volume 1. What they did was they went and investigated every biblical establishment in the US. They worked out whether they were religiously affiliated or not. And the ones that were religiously affiliated, they asked them, do you have a statement of faith? The majority of them actually either refused to comment or lied. And a lot of them actually admitted that they do have a statement of faith. What's really interesting is the ones that lied, because they have a statement of faith. It's visible on their website, and yet they refused to admit that they had one. I mean, that just looks like a guilty conscience all over. But I'm sure you'd agree that anyone who signs a statement of faith has effectively signed their soul away. They've removed all academic freedom. They have no intellectual honesty, to be honest. That's what I would have to call it. A statement of faith is a statement of commitment to dishonesty, and there's no good way to say that.
Yeah, I detest statements of faith. I don't think they. I mean, it's a disservice really to the people that they hire, because it kind of like you say. I mean, when I'm thinking about scholarly opinions and I hear there's a statement of faith, like it's very hard for me to think that this particular scholar is uncontaminated by extraneous influences. And the idea, like I was saying before, like as a layman, I want to look to the scholarly consensus. That is contingent on the scholarly consensus being unburdened and actually having the freedom to investigate and come to their own conclusions. And if that's not there, then that entire idea kind of crumbles a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I
And
agree
there
about
is
that.
more to it than that. So you could say, okay, the majority of secular scholars actually agree that Jesus existed. Because I would say, like, even if you cut the Christians out of it, you cut the statements of faith out of it, but how many of them have actually done the research on this? Or are they just repeating what they've heard?
Yeah, that part is more difficult for me to swallow, because it's like, um, I feel like I can say that about anything. I can say that about any consensus. Whereas the statement of faith thing is kind of in your face.
Well, you
It's
could take evolution, for example. So all of the
yeah,
peer-reviewed academic scholarship sides with evolution. None of it sides against it. There's no qualified evolutionary biologist arguing that evolution doesn't exist. So that's a completely different state of affairs than it is with the historicity of Jesus, where
it,
all of
it
the
is.
scholarship in the last 100 years covering historicity has concluded that he didn't exist.
Um, okay, so I mean, obviously the evidence for evolution is obviously much stronger. So it's
Yeah, just using it as an obvious example
yeah,
of recent
yeah.
publications.
I
Yeah.
guess so I think about it similarly. So sometimes I'm not a biologist and I'm not a chemist, um, but I've tooled through some of these. What's the name of it? Like IEC or something, or Answers in Genesis is arguably the most
AIG,
famous,
yeah.
but it's yeah AIG. But there's another one. It's like the
There's ID,
IC.
which is intelligent design, or C design proponentsists, which is
Yeah,
they were caught in the court of law just doing a find and replace on one of their creationist books into intelligent design book. So that was
yeah. So I went to a fundamentalist high school, and they taught us in schools about all of the fallacies of evolution and all of the ways in which it couldn't possibly be true. And this is not very long ago. And
Yeah, me too. We were taught
so
about the bombardier beetle being proof against evolution, and
yeah,
we didn't actually
right.
have biology
Yeah,
classes because biology was the work
exactly.
of the devil.
Right, of course. Um, and the idea is, some of this stuff when I first hear it sounds very convincing because they couch it in biology and chemistry and DNA, and they wrap it all up in a way that sounds plausible. Of course, I don't actually know anything about any of these subjects. It sounds very plausible. Like, I don't, when I read the article, I don't have a refutation just because I don't know any of the subject matter. I just kind of say, yeah. I do kind of just look to the consensus, and it's difficult, because I could just say the same thing. I could just say, well, these consensus, like, they're clearly just ignoring the fallibility of carbon dating. Look, they tested a snail and it got 200,000 years, even though it was born in my backyard or something. And it's, I don't know, this idea of
Yeah,
questioning
there's a
whether
lot
they've
of
done the research or
misuse
not. Just
of sources for that kind of thing. So like it has to be
sure,
within
sure.
the last 50,000 years. It can't be like after the
Yeah, and there's a
1950s.
nice
There's
overlap
limitations.
of how they calibrate these things as well. And the kicker for me was that dendrochronologies in particular are an
Yeah,
incredibly good
they
way
overlay perfectly with carbon
to
dating, and
calibrate
of
carbon
course
dating.
they have no idea that there are many different forms of radiometric dating. Carbon is just one of them.
Right, and there's many different forms they overlap. It's an incredibly advanced science. It's just that you're not going to find any, and there's a few of them actually, like responding to creationist claims, but you're not going to find, if I just go to the internet, I'm probably not going to be able to find the exact layman's description of, how they calibrate carbon dating without doing some work to figure that out myself. And so the first time I hear it, it sounds very convincing to me, and it just kind of seems like the consensus is biased. I guess that's energy
Yeah,
that I'm
and the
getting at.
best way to check that is when you get the two opposing claims, you just fact check both of them and just go, okay, which one of these guys are telling the truth? Like find something they disagree on, which is a fact, and then go to the source and find out which one of those is right about the objective status of that fact.
So, do you have a favorite mythicist? Like, if I were to buy a book and read it, do you have a recommendation?
I mean, Richard Carrier is the only one who's published a comprehensive mythicist argument, so he would be the best. If you wanted the scholarly version, that would be On the Historicity of Jesus. He's written like a shorter, more like layperson argument, which is Jesus from outer space. So that covers like a few responses, and it like simplifies everything that he argues in On the Historicity of Jesus. Because the scholarly book is like a 700-page tome, whereas
Okay,
Jesus from
yeah.
Outer Space is much shorter and more to the point, which might be what you're going for.
Yeah, I want the space one. That sounds like more fun.
Yeah, and also if you want to read the best arguments for the opposition, have you read Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist?
I have it on the shelf. No, I think I have How Jesus Became God on the shelf. You mentioned that
Yeah,
one as
so
well.
yeah,
Is that
so
worth
Did
reading?
Jesus Exist is Bart Ehrman's best case for a historical Jesus. So I would always recommend read both sides of the argument. Unfortunately, there's no scholarly argument for the historicity of Jesus, and there's nothing that responds to Carrier because the only two books arguing for the historical Jesus are Ehrman and Maurice Casey, but both of them were published before Carrier's book. So we're still waiting for like a scholarly response to Carrier's arguments, but that's the best we've got for historicity at the moment. Uh, if you do want a scholarly argument for historicity, there's one from Shirley Jackson Case on the historicity of Jesus, published in 1912. So
Okay.
if you wanted to like have a proper academic one, that would be the one to go for. But we've
That
learned a
seems
lot
kind of old.
since then. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is very old.
That seems
We've learned
incredibly
so
old.
much since then. It's based on
A
old
lot.
datings.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the issue really with this. We need someone who's a qualified scholar to publish a defense of Jesus and actually address all of the arguments that Carrier's made.
Okay.
The only other peer-reviewed book about historicity has been Raphael Latasta, and he sided with Carrier effectively, arguing
Interesting.
for agnosticism.
All right. Maybe
So
I'll read
he's a PhD in
Carrier then.
religious studies. Carrier's PhD in ancient history. Um,
Mm,
Bart Ehrman has got a PhD in theology from his theological seminary, so it's not great. He doesn't get all of the context, but he's still, he's still a bona fide scholar.
right. And is it what? You recommended Did Jesus Exist, but what about the other one that I think the one I have is How Jesus
Uh,
Became God.
Yeah, I mean, Bart Ehrman's done a lot of good books. I highly recommend reading Forged if you've not read it. That's about the origins of the New Testament, as in like who the authors were, which books are forged, which aren't forged. It's basically going through how the history of Christian writing is basically just polemics attacking each other, and a lot of them were written by people, or they claim to be written by someone who didn't write them. So that's a really interesting book. It's actually quite short, and it just goes through like the whole New Testament, what was and wasn't written by the person claiming to have written it.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the recommendation. Maybe I'll read that Carrier book. I think that sounds
Yeah,
like
no, and thanks for the
what I'm looking
conversation.
for.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was good.
and let me know what you find, especially if you can do any like fact checking in the background. It's worth just double checking on stuff.
Yeah, I really doubt that I'm going to be able to fact check someone like Richard Carrier. That'll have the sufficient drive or
It's
ability.
pretty
But
easy because he'll cite like the exact page numbers of the original sources, so he makes it really easy for you to go find what you're looking for. Like when you read
oh,
Christian
good.
apologists and stuff, they often don't cite their sources, but because this is like
That is true.
like academic books, so
Yeah.
sometimes in Jesus from Outer Space, he'll actually cite his own scholarship, like in On the Historicity of Jesus, because that's the most relevant source.
Right.
But I've got copies of that. If you wanted to like see the original, I can take chunks of that out for you and give it to you.
That's very nice of you. Thanks, Joel, for the conversation again.
No,
It
no
was
worries.
good.
I always want to encourage people studying history. So thanks for calling in.
It is interesting, so keep it up. All right, I'll talk to you some other time.
Yeah,
See ya.
cheers. Yeah, if anyone wants
Cheers,
to call in or chip in, then feel free to jump in the conversation as well. Did you want to say anything, Thomas? You've been sat on speaker for a while.
Oh yeah, hey, I was just very much enjoying that last conversation between you and Dave. I was on the edge of my seat, listening.
Yeah, I appreciate Dave because he thinks these things through and he's careful about the logic and obviously when I say something that's not entirely accurate, he'll pull me up on that and we can address that. So it's
Mhm.
always it's a profitable conversation. Effectively, it's
Yes,
something where I learn a lot as well.
a good logical dialectic. I agree. So I'm pretty much, I read most of that Carrier book on most of what I could find online, which was most of it. So I'm pretty much there with him until I see a rebuttal. You know what I mean? So I'm kind of at the same point you are.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few attempts to rebut it, but
Yeah,
most of them kind of misrepresent what's in the book,
yeah.
which is a bit of an issue. So I think the best thing would be to have like Carrier have like a full-on conversation with another historian, like someone who's not a
Mhm.
theologian, someone who
Yeah,
wasn't just
not yeah,
trained in New
yeah, yeah,
Testament, but someone who understands history.
yeah.
Get the two of them to have a conversation, and then have them write like the best defense of historicity, like preferably like a PhD historian, someone like that who understands the
Well, that would be
methodology and the
fantastic.
history. And then obviously you could have Carrier as a peer reviewer. We've got Daniel calling in, so let's have a look.
I'll let
See
you
what
go
he has
back
to
to
say.
that.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas.
Thank
I'm
you.
trying to click on it. There we go.
Yeah.
You're in, Daniel.
Okay,
Welcome
can
back.
y'all hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, look, so I've been listening to the other conversations. I haven't gotten off. But there's some things that you touched on that I'm not going to touch on right now. But like I do kind of disagree with how you said that I disagree with mathematics, and I think that you might be confusing a sound argument with a valid argument, which neither one of them is discredible. A sound argument is just stronger.
Well, maybe we just misunderstood each other. So when I
I
said
think there
if your
was
highest number is 0, then all your other numbers are 0 or lower.
right, but that is the either or. I mean, that's the law of the excluded middle. I mean, it's either true or it's not. So that's a whole
Well,
nother thing.
it's
But
mathematics. It's less than, greater than. I mean, you
right,
can't
no,
really
I
argue against that,
understand.
right?
Well, yeah, because you're not going to disagree against mathematics because it's the one universal language that everybody understands, and it all is observational. So, but this is in
Yeah.
respect to you. This is what I wanted to share. Um, the best evidence that I have for the historical and the divine Jesus. One thing that I look at that I've noticed that has had the most impact on me is what we look at as called the ripple effect. And basically, it's one event that causes multiple events afterwards. So, whether the whole Bible is false, whether all 15 secular sources is false, whether Bart Ehrman, which confirms certain things are false, what was the impact afterwards? There were deaths. This is the rise of Christianity was the fastest growing religion ever. Not only that, but it didn't stop. It's also the most
so
worldwide.
it grew at about the same rate as Mormonism at roughly 4% per
No.
generation.
I mean, you know, I'm taking into consideration about what you're saying, but I'm sorry if my tone puts me off as, you know, dismissive, but that's not what I'm trying to do at all. So,
Well, so
I'll
have you
apologize
read
for that.
The Triumph of Christianity by Bart Ehrman? Because he graphs this out.
You know what's
talks
funny?
about the
Yes, I actually have that book open and in my hand as we speak. So he says that in 30 CE there was 20 Christians, 60. Well, I'm not going to go all through down the list, but basically,
we're kind of estimating the numbers.
yeah, about 400 CE, which would be Common Era. It says that it grew to 35 million Christians. That is incomparable to any other religion at all. And then not only that, but those who supposedly created the story died for it. But even if you refute that, it's the growth. And then one thing really quick, and I hope that this isn't disrespectful for anyone, but if I can just read this real quick, this is what convinced me that, now this is classical logic. This is using evidence, science, and reason. Evidence, science, and logic. I'm sorry. That's classical philosophy. So this was written previously. Like somebody can say that the events were written after the fact. This dismisses all of that. Everything I mentioned. It's what it says about Gamaliel's advice, which was Paul's, basically his teacher. It says that he said to them, men of Israel, take heed to yourself of what you intend to do regarding these men. For some time ago, theists rode up, which is a point that I wanted to touch on from a previous caller that said, I wouldn't doubt that there are different people named Jesus that rose up. Yeah, there were. And it says it right here. Theists rose up, claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all that who obeyed scattered him and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days. These are all people claiming to be the Messiah. Okay? And then he says, now I say to you, keep away from these men and let them alone. This is what convinced me Christianity was true. For if
So
this
this
plan,
is from Acts, isn't it?
This is from Acts. Yes, very good. It says, and now I say to you, keep on. Okay, for if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing, as all the previous examples. But if it's of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you found even to fight against God. So basically, why are we still even talking about this?
Well,
what
so
was the impact
it's interesting that you
after?
mentioned those characters from Acts, because that's one way we know that Luke copied from Josephus' Antiquities, because those three
Yeah, well,
characters are mentioned in that order in Antiquities.
yes, we already said that Luke was a
But
secondary. He was a secondary source.
yeah, but they're not
Luke went
mentioned in date
around,
order. So Luke
right,
mistakes the
but
order in
see,
the text for the date order, and he gets it wrong.
you're right. Okay, well, hold on, wait. Let me just touch on what you said real quick, because I know how long our conversations can be, because we both have a lot of information that we can share to each other back and forth. But Luke, as I mentioned earlier, is a secondary source. Now, traditionally in ancient times, most of what was passed down was spoken word. Luke went and gathered what was spoken. Some of it was being written, whether it was 60 AD, whether it was 100 AD, whether it was 500 AD, the same time as Alexander the Great, it's irrelevant, because Luke's information that he gathered, even if it was by word of mouth and there was no other documents, has been historically confirmed and 99.5% accurate. that says a lot in itself. And
I don't
that
know
is
where you're
what
getting that
convinced me.
percentage
But,
from.
well, I mean, you can research it. You can look it up. Like, just
I
say how
have, yeah.
accurate, how reliable is the Bible? What's the
Terribly
accuracy rate
unreliable.
of the reliability of the Bible? Like, however you want to look it up. You can look up Luke as a historian, you know.
Yeah,
But
you
I
can
mean,
look up
it's,
Luke as a historian. There's no record of him. There isn't even
yeah.
a
Well,
record of
you
Luke being a
can
historian
do the
in
research.
Acts.
Like, don't dismiss what is there though, because like I said,
No, so I'm
you
dismissing what's not there.
no, but what do you mean? Okay, so that's the a priori argument. That's like
So
taking
the idea
something.
that Luke's a historian is
But
based
hold
on.
on, wait. Let me finish that statement. See what's happening here is the argument that you're coming from is called a priori, where you take evidence and try to cut it down rather than seeing the evidence that has grown. You take what happened and you test it by the ripple effect. What was the and it's a law of causality. What was the cause and what was the effect?
So
Everything has to have a cause. What was the cause of Christianity today? What's the cause of this conversation? What's the
well, that's the
cause
question. So
of the
is
apostles
the cause
dying?
of
Hold on, wait.
Christianity the life of Jesus, or was it the claims of Peter? Because it could be one or the other.
That's a lot for people to say. I mean, you know what? That's a lot of commandments for just Peter to write. There's 1,050 commandments in the New Testament. I do not think it was all from Peter at all.
No. So nobody's saying Peter wrote the entire New Testament. Just that he was the founder of the cult, and then
Well,
other apostles came after him
but
as well.
see, the word cult just does not fit
Okay, so
into a
I'm using it
religion
in the historical
that
context.
is what that dies for the proclamation that Jesus was the disciple. Jesus, I mean,
No,
the Messiah.
so in terms of history, all religions are cults. That's just what the word cult means in the
Okay, well,
historical
then maybe
context.
I
There's nothing
misunderstood that term
derogatory
then.
about it. It comes from the same root as
It's a little
cultivar.
offensive of a word, maybe, I guess, but
Yeah,
I
so
didn't mean to.
you know the word cultivate when you're talking about looking after a field, looking after your crops, yeah?
Right, sure, yeah.
Basically, cult comes from cultivar. It's the care of the gods. It's to look after your gods in terms of like worshipping them, building churches, all that stuff. You know, there's nothing inherently derogatory about it. So I'm using it in the sense of like the historical perspective, not like a
Okay,
modern derogatory sense.
okay. Look, before we get off into other bunny trails, because I would love to interact with you more, because I think that this is some very educational, profitable conversation. However, this is one of the other things that I want to say, since you mentioned the New Testament, since y'all were talking about Paul earlier. After the ripple effect of Jesus dying, what made Paul go from a Christian killer to one dying for Christ? What was the motive? Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody hand over their position, their high position in the synagogue, to execute whatever they wanted and die for what they were killing?
I mean, we can only speculate on that. I think personally, if you wanted to look at Paul's motivations, if he was persecuting people and, I don't know, torturing or killing them, which wouldn't be too out of the ordinary, if he was commissioned by the Sanhedrin. Although he says he's a Pharisee, which is a bit weird. Pharisees wouldn't normally work for the Sanhedrin because the Sadducees and Pharisees hated each other. But if you assume that Paul had a genuine change of heart and he's not lying, let's go with the assumption that he's genuine. I think the most probable cause for that would just be guilt. He was guilty at having persecuted these Christians and then sort of came around to believing in the same God as them.
Yeah, but
He
what
sort of
caused
started to
his
see their
guilt,
point of
though?
view.
Did that guilt just so happen to happen right after Jesus' death, whenever Stephen the martyr prayed for him? I mean,
Well, no,
come on
so
now. Like, I mean,
Paul
something
never met
happened.
Jesus. So
No, Paul didn't have to meet Jesus.
yeah,
Paul
so
didn't
Paul
have to
never
meet
met
Jesus.
Jesus, so it couldn't have been
Him
Jesus.
dying for what he was killing for is evidential. Now, like I said, that is just part of the ripple effect. It's still going. It's over 2.5 million believers in that Jesus is Lord. And not
Yeah, so
only that,
that's not really relevant to historicity because now you're
it
just
might
talking
not
about a
be,
God spreading.
but it is relevant to the ripple effect, because the Quran has over 800 million copies sold, and that's like second in line. Who's still widespread in the world? Christianity with over 8 billion copies, 8 to 10 billion copies distributed, and
but
a
after the
Bible
first
gets downloaded.
generation,
Right. Okay.
even
But
if you
listen.
assume that there
Okay.
was a real
First
guy,
generation.
after the
Okay.
first
But
generation, they're not talking about a historical person. This is the god they're worshipping. So worshipping a god
okay.
doesn't prove that a historical man existed.
Okay. Well, real quick, so I can get back off in respect to Tom and everyone else listening. But what is still happening now? It's the most discussed topic in the world. It's what people still die for. It's still changing lives to this day. You have over 3 million people talking about near-death experiences where they encountered a spiritual being. Like, so
Well, when
all
you're
of them
talking
were
about people,
hallucinating.
you're
No,
talking about
no, no,
martyrdom,
no.
right? When you say people die
Well,
for
no,
something,
not
can
necessarily
they die for
martyrism.
something that they believe but they're honestly wrong about? So like,
But see, why? But see, if they were eyewitnesses, as we assume, such
well, so
as
obviously modern people weren't eyewitnesses. Now you're talking about a different thing.
I am. No, because they all died. They all died a martyr's death. I mean,
everybody
Paul, even
dies.
Paul, even I know, but whenever you allow yourself to be executed because it says to love your neighbor as yourself, that's a lot different than just dying
so
out of natural causes.
Do you have a historical source of someone who was an eyewitness of Jesus dying?
That's what I'm
as
telling
a martyr?
you.
Do you have any
That's
of
what
that?
I'm telling. Listen to me. I have hundreds of thousands of people still being martyred that never even saw Jesus. Like I
So
said, you
I'm
can
talking about someone who did see Jesus.
but listen,
Do you have one
you
that
can
did
still,
see Jesus?
but listen, that's irrelevant. I'm gonna tell you why.
It's
Because
completely irrelevant. That's how history works.
no, listen. You can make that irrelevant. You can disclose everything that happened prior to the New Testament being written. What is the cause and what is the effect of Christianity?
No, but do you have an
But
eyewitness
why
account
is
of a
it still
historical
sweeping
Jesus?
across the world? Listen to me. Listen. Over 8 to 10 billion copies distributed, over 3,000 languages translated to.
That's not relevant.
Okay,
This is just a Gish
and
Gallop.
no.
Do
You
you know
asked
what
me
a
what
Gish
my
Gallop is?
no, but listen,
Okay, so it's
because
named after Dwayne Gish, who's a Christian apologist, and his approach was to tell so many lies in such a short space of time that the person
but
on
what
the
I'm
opposite
saying isn't a
side didn't
lie.
have
It's
time
obvious.
to
You can
rebut
observe
each
it.
lie.
You can see the impact of
Um,
Christianity.
so the opposite of a Gish Gallop would be one claim at a time, and then evaluating that claim, on its own merits, rather than
Okay,
just spitting
claim
out a whole load of them in a
Christianity,
row.
cause, ripple effect. Let's discuss it then.
Okay, so how is a ripple
You want to
effect
start from the very
evidence of a
beginning?
historical Jesus?
Like we can go back 2,000 plus years and start from the apostles and work
Yeah,
all the way
let's
back
start
up
from
to
the
what's still
apostles. Yeah.
happening now. Yeah, we
So
can do that. But I
which
mean, like, how much time do you have? Because I was trying to get
well,
off
so
of here.
just pick one. We'll go with one for now.
Do you want to start with the apostles or do you want to talk about modern day? Because my whole thing about
I want
my
to talk about
best
history because I'm
evidence,
talking about
but
history.
listen, you asked me what my best evidence of a historical, I'm giving you my best evidence of not just a historical Jesus, but also
Yeah,
a
but
divine
you haven't gotten
Jesus.
around to your first piece of evidence yet.
What do you want me to do? Send you links? Like, you want me to send you links to everything I'm saying? Because there is
No,
evidence.
I want you to name a source, and then we can look at that source
NBC
for how
News.
good it is.
How about
You think
NBC News?
NBC News mentioned the historical Jesus 2,000 years ago?
Yes, yeah. No, I'm talking about NBC News confirms that, and you can check the top 10. I can send you 10, 15, 20 sources
I'm talking about a
that
primary
show.
source, a source written by someone who could attest to
Do
the
you know
existence of a
that the
historical
amount?
Jesus.
Do you know that the amount of sources is stronger than a single primary source?
Great, give me
Do you
one.
know if you give me one piece of evidence and I
Give me one
refute
piece
it
of
with
evidence.
9 other pieces of more reliable evidence, your evidence has been refuted.
Great, give me
But
one
see,
piece of
that's
evidence.
what I'm. One piece of evidence. I already did. I gave you multiple of them. How about the rise of Christianity? That, like you
That's not
said, see, you
evidence.
accept. Yes, it is evidence. It's a cause and effect. It's
Okay,
the law of
so
causality.
what
How is that
evidence
not
is the
evidence?
definition of
Like
evidence.
you're like that's
Evidence
basically.
evidence is a fact which supports one hypothesis more than the other hypothesis. The rise of
Hypothesis is
Christianity.
that.
Yeah, the rise of
Christianity is
Christianity
true,
happened
and
regardless of historicity. So on mythicism, Christianity happened, and on historicity, Christianity happened. The rise of Christianity is not evidence for either position.
yes, it is. The rise of anything is evidence of its position.
So what evidence is? Evidence is a
Whenever
fact
are you
which supports
telling
one
me?
hypothesis more than it supports the opposing
Hold on,
hypothesis.
wait. You're telling me that if a gang shooting happens in front of my house and 50 people see it, that's not convincing. That's not more than just saying, "Oh yeah, I saw it." Just one person? No,
No,
the
then you would have
amount.
50 eyewitness accounts. That would be good evidence. Do you have 50 eyewitness accounts? Let's start with
Well,
the first one. What is the first eyewitness account?
look, let me tell you something, okay? We're getting into this. I can already tell just from me trying to call in for a couple minutes has taken this long. But like I
Yeah,
said, in
because
respect to
you
you to
haven't brought
answer,
up your first piece of evidence yet.
my first piece of evidence is obvious. The rise of Christianity, the effect
Yeah,
of
which
the
we've
cause.
addressed. We've addressed the rise of Christianity. Just wait. Your evidence needs to support one hypothesis more than it supports the other hypothesis. The rise of Christianity happened in both cases. On mythicism, the rise of Christianity happened. On historicity, the rise of Christianity happened.
But
That is
if
not
it's
evidence for either
mythicism, it
position.
happened because why would mythicism rise that fast? Why would people die for mythicism?
It happened about in either
Like
case. It
that
makes no
really makes no
difference.
sense. There's three motives to do something, and it's power, sex, or money. What was the motives of the disciples for writing the gospels? Like that just doesn't make sense. They
Well, so
wanted,
you
they
would
had
first
the
have to
motive.
argue that the disciples existed, and you would have to also argue
Oh
that
my
any
gosh,
disciples wrote
there's
any
like
gospels.
graves of them. There's their heads, their bones, their graves. It's all like
Okay,
check
give me the best
archaeology.
example of a grave. This is original. I've not had this kind of
Oh my
example
goodness,
of an
man.
argument
You
before.
know, I do
This is
enjoy
new.
our conversation. However,
Do you
this
have
is
one example?
ending up. Yeah, I'm about to give it to you. This is ending up being longer than what I expected. But you asked me what my best evidence for the historical Jesus is, and my reason was the rise of Christianity, which is the law of causality, cause and effect. What happened and what was the effect of it?
Yeah, but
Jesus
the
happened,
problem
and the
is,
effect of it was the Christianity, the religion itself, and the rise
no, but
of it.
you're not taking the hypothesis into account. In order
But
to provide
see, I'm
evidence,
giving this
you have
to
to
you as
understand. You have to understand what is it evidence of? What is it supporting? Now, the rise of Christianity happens in either case, which means that the rise of Christianity is not evidence for either one case over the other. What you're doing is you're arguing for the existence of Christianity, which isn't relevant.
no,
You
that's
need
not
to
what I'm
argue for the
arguing
existence
about.
of a
I'm
historical
arguing about the
Jesus.
existence of the historical and divine Jesus.
Yeah, but
That's
you
what
need to actually
that's
provide
what I'm talking
evidence that
about.
supports that case. So, on mythicism, the rise of Christianity happened. So, the rise of Christianity is not an argument against mythicism. It's included in mythicism.
There might be some rise in Catholicism, but there will not be as much as what there is. I mean, come on now, like that's comparing
I
one
don't think you
minor
understand how
thing to
evidence
another.
works. So,
I'm
evidence
not
has to
using
support
evidence.
one
I'm not
position.
using evidence. I'm using logic, and that's what I'm
I've
trying to
noticed
tell
you're
you.
not
You're
using
asking for
evidence. Yeah,
evidence.
I agree.
You're
You're
asking
not
for
using evidence.
evidence of laws that I am mentioning, like the law of causality, the law of cause and effect. You're asking me for evidence of a natural law, which look it up. Look up the law of causality. It'll tell you what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but
Jesus
that's not.
was,
We're not
but
talking
no,
about
but
natural
I'm
law.
not.
We're talking about the
You talk
existence of a
about because
historical
see,
Jesus.
right now, physical evidence is not what I can give you. I can give you logic right
I've
now.
noticed
I can
that.
give you
Yeah,
logic and reasoning right now. That's all I can offer you over the phone.
I'm not
So,
convinced
I
that this is
mean,
logic,
you can't
but
disclude that and say, well, what is your physical evidence? I'm going to exclude your logic and your reason and why you even told me why you think that the historical Jesus is not only uh, an actual person or was an actual person, but also the divine Son of God. So, like I said, in calling to respects to you, I was letting you know what to me is the biggest piece of evidence is. You don't have. I don't need the Bible for that.
Yeah, you said that Luke mentioned 3 messianic figures who failed, and that was your best evidence.
No, what I said was the rise of Christianity is my best evidence.
Yeah, you were talking
What
about
I said was
Gamaliel
is
or something.
even Bart Ehrman, but obviously, like I mean, I could send you the
Well,
graph.
Bart Ehrman would not use this argument, but there's no way Bart Ehrman would use this argument
I'm
for
reading
a
it out
historical
of his
Jesus.
book in my hand. What are you talking? I'm reading it out of his book, the one you mentioned,
The Triumph of
Triumph over
Christianity.
Christianity, right?
Now, so that book doesn't argue for a historical Jesus. It assumes a historical Jesus. That's not how argumentation works.
Okay. Well, look, like I said, in respect to all the callers, I apologize to everyone for being on this long, but that's my best evidence for the historical and
I
the
mean,
divine
we don't
Jesus.
have another caller queued at the moment, so you're fine, unless someone else wants to join
Yeah,
in.
but see, I mean, I'm ready to get off. I've talked twice. I think that talking more and more is just, you got to know when to stop. Like, you got to know when it could turn into potentially something more than just a discussion. And I'm not getting heated at all. Like, I like talking to you, but
Yeah,
I do
I
have
appreciate your input's refreshing. I've never had someone say that the best evidence for Jesus is the grave of a disciple. That's a new one on me, so I appreciated that.
it's not the grave of the disciple. That's not what I said. It's cause and effect.
And
That's
by the
not
way,
just the grave. That's not just the grave of any disciple. If Christianity is true, then
if you
that's the
enjoyed this
grave
conversation,
of the Alpha and the Omega God.
so
That is
if
the
you look up
evidence of the Christian God. Period.
if you look at the other call-in shows, the Pangburn
Look,
Hangout has multiple call-in shows, so you might be interested in some of the other subjects they discuss. They
yeah,
discuss
I would
Christianity, for
definitely
example.
be.
So yeah, check
Yeah,
that out, have a look. You might want to
absolutely.
subscribe. And
Yeah,
yeah,
look, please do me
thanks
a
for joining
favor.
us.
Look, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry for having such a broad amount of stuff at first, but Jesus never existed. It's kind of a broad statement, so I had a lot of broad responses.
Yeah,
So
we've got to focus on like a single piece of evidence at a time because it can get a bit overwhelming otherwise.
right,
So
but whenever it says Jesus never existed, that is a claim, and my first thing is refuting it because you can't really say that he didn't. I mean, that's a pretty
yeah,
broad
so
claim.
I think what you need to do for next time when you want to do argumentation, you want to pick one claim, focus in on that claim, get to the evidence of that claim, and make sure that it actually so that it sides with one hypothesis over the other. So you need to understand what the opponent's argument is. You need to match your argument so that it is the opposite side of that, and then you can
Right,
start talking evidence.
right. My request was just that you maybe add it in the description or something, just to kind of specify it a little bit more, because I've been studying on Christianity and the rise of all religions for probably about 10 years. So I do have a lot of information, and a lot of it is on the historical and the divine Jesus. So whenever I see a claim such as Jesus never existed, well, there's a lot that comes with that. Like you have to tell me why none of what I give you is valid and this is true, because that's a broad statement. I mean, you got to understand like where I'm coming from. But like I said, in respect to you, I hope I answered your question respectfully. And y'all have a good night, man. And I appreciate you taking my call. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for joining. We certainly had a conversation.
Absolutely, man. Thank you.
Okay, in the absence of other callers at the moment, I'll have a look through the chat and see what questions are coming up there. So Travis said, Joel, what is Ehrman's strongest piece of evidence? I mean, it depends whether you think it's what Ehrman thinks his strongest evidence is or what his strongest evidence actually is. He seems to think that he has dozens of independent eyewitness sources for Jesus. He won't actually provide any of them. The closest we've got to an actual extant source would be Paul, and that would be Ehrman's reading of Paul. It doesn't actually respond to the mythicist arguments because he hasn't read them. So his argument is effectively reading Paul, assuming that the Gospels narrative is before Paul, and then reading Paul in that light. So that seems to be his strongest argument. And at least Paul is the earliest source, so you could give him points for that. let's see. How do you know he hasn't read them? So Ehrman hasn't got a clue what the arguments for mythicism are, and he makes this very clear in every interview. Every time he tries to argue against mythicism, he's arguing against like a Carrier-esque zeitgeist mythicism, against like Joseph Atwill type mythicism. He doesn't pick up on any of the arguments within the scholarship and doesn't respond to any of the arguments within the scholarship. He doesn't show any awareness of them. If people ask him malformed questions, like if someone asks him a question which is a bad representation of what's in the scholarship, he doesn't correct them. He just has no idea what's in the scholarship. He even shows no awareness of basic facts as well that are cited within the scholarship, unless he discovers them himself independently. But then again, that just shows he still hasn't read the scholarship. He's discovered it via some other route. So like his discovery that Philo mentions a similar character to Jesus. He discovered that through his own readings of Philo, completely independent of the information cited within Carrier's book. His discovery that Paul actually does have a high Christology, and he's referencing in a celestial Jesus very early on. This is something that Ehrman discovered independently of reading Carrier. Even though Carrier had told him this, he denied it, and then went and discovered it years later. So, yeah, I mean, it's possible that he's read the book and then forgotten everything that was in it, but it seems very much as if he's just unaware of the book's existence. There was an interview he had on Holy Kool-Aid, Holy Kool-Aid Bart Ehrman. It's quite an interesting one where he says, "Oh, what mythicists need to do is publish publish better arguments than the ones that he'd listed, but they have." He's just unaware of them. So yeah, everything Ehrman says on the subject of mythicism just shows he doesn't actually know what the mythicists argue. He hasn't read the scholarship on it, and I don't know why. It wouldn't be that difficult. So yeah, anybody else want to call in? I see a comment. Can you cover Peter again? What? The guy that used to catch loaves and his friends that used to turn into fish. Evidence for Peter. So the Peter of the Gospels is a mythical character. The Peter of Acts is a mythical character. These were written by people who probably never even met Peter. But the Peter who's opposing Paul, that seems to be like a real guy. Paul says that he was the first person to see Jesus in a vision specifically. This is in 1 Corinthians 15. So what you get from that is Peter is opposing Paul. He appears to be somebody who's highly literate, religious leader, very confident of himself, claims to have visions of Jesus, just like Paul. We know he's literate because Paul is using reading the scriptures as his main argument. He's up against Peter, and he never tries to say against Peter, I can read and you can't, because that would have been a killer argument. So that means Peter could read. And that's not surprising. We're talking about a cult which is based on reading scripture. So, how would the founder of the cult not be able to read? It wouldn't make sense. The idea that Peter is a fisherman comes from the Gospels. The idea that he's illiterate comes from Acts. And this is a common theme among religions. So like Islam did this too. You try and make your guy seem more miraculous by saying he was illiterate but still understood the scriptures, and God chose him. It's like a way of appealing to the lower classes who couldn't read and write. And yeah, makes it feel more miraculous as well. So I would say Peter did exist. We have eyewitness attestation of Peter as a man, where Paul places him in Jerusalem, so already better than Jesus. Eyewitness in Jerusalem. So that's pretty solid evidence. We don't really have any evidence against Peter's existence. We even have people forging letters in his name. He was an early cult figure. And Paul, we even have a hostile account because Paul, of course, calls Peter a fake apostle, tells him he's a false prophet, and confronts him to his face. So you're ticking a whole bunch of boxes here. Eyewitness account, very clearly historical person, and it's a hostile account. So that's pretty solid, I would say. Did you want to jump in at all, Thomas? Do you think there was anything I didn't cover?
I mean, you've covered quite a bit of further than some of it further than I've gone into, so I've learned a lot.
Yeah, this went down some rabbit holes I wasn't expecting.
Evidence. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. You carry on. Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying to the audience, with historical evidence, it's done differently than empirical evidence. And that's a lot of what Joel was trying to say to people the entire night. You know what I mean?
I mean, it's still empirical. It's just
Yes.
weaker because it's circumstantial, and
Right.
you're relying on accounts written by someone. So you're
We're
already
trying to
secondary at that
figure out
point.
in a 2,000-year-old language who told the anecdotes. You know what I mean? Like where the anecdotes came from in terms of sourcing, right?
Yeah, so ultimately, because this is all like hearsay, and the sources are tampered with, we didn't even go down the whole. The words that we've got now aren't the words that were originally written. They're full of
Exactly.
mistakes and changes, and
Yep,
we don't know who wrote
400,000
what.
or something like that.
Yeah, it's the sheer number of changes that have gone through are pretty horrific as well. So anytime we're focusing down on like a particular spelling of one letter in a manuscript, that's always going to be a bit risky because we don't know what the original texts were.
Yeah.
But I would still say it's an empirical system because we're still looking at balance of evidence, probability. We're still
You're looking at
at
language too, which is, technically an empirical.
and trying to
setup.
understand the original context. So, we're not native speakers of a 2,000-year-old language. So there's going to be some ambiguity in there. And the
Exactly.
solution to that is just acknowledge the ambiguity. When you're not
Yes.
certain, just say, we're not certain about this.
That's right.
Could go either way, or, weak evidence, for example.
I mean, I love talking about this because I have not been convinced by Bart Ehrman for or Richard Carrier against just yet. I lean towards the ideology of mythicism as you're putting forth, but I just don't know yet. So I'm still waiting for some good rebuttals from a real historian, like you mentioned, would be awesome.
Peter Box has mentioned another
Peter.
question. Yeah, the fisherman guy was probably illiterate. Well, the fisherman thing is not true. That's a fictional invention. How long after the supposed death of Christ? I mean, so if you're going to go with a historical Jesus, then Peter would be a contemporary of him. Based on basing it in the 30s. The cult starts around the 30s anyway, so you're looking at Peter and Jesus being about the same age, roughly, or within a few decades of each other, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, so obviously, if Jesus wasn't real, then you've still got Peter existing around that time, most likely born like somewhere
Real quick,
between
Joel
10
question.
and yeah.
The Peter, the disciple, is not the Peter that, just so I'm clear, is not the Peter that Paul is referencing, right?
So Peter the disciple was named after the
right
apostle.
in the Gospels, right?
Yeah, because Peter the disciple is a character from the Gospels and Acts.
Right.
Peter the apostle is, I mean, so technically they called him an apostle as well.
So do you think they made Peter up for the Gospels? Is that what you think? From the Peter that was actually referenced?
I think Mark was poking fun at Peter. He was characterizing him as an idiot. So he was acknowledging his supremacy in the sense that Peter was the first one, the preferred disciple in that sense. But he's also calling him an idiot, making fun of him, telling him he's a traitor.
Right.
So
okay.
you can
Because
tell Mark is
of
on
the
Paul's side.
I'm sorry, there was a delay. I apologize. What was that?
You can tell that Mark is more in favor of a Pauline theology. Matthew is more on Peter's side. He sides more with the concept of Peter having a more Jewish Jesus.
Okay. And we know the temple was 70 AD, right?
Yeah, destruction of temples. So the Jewish war was between 66 and 74-ish, but it was 70 when Jerusalem fell.
Okay. So that would have been Pauline epistles before that, Gospels after, right?
Yeah, that's a clear dividing line between the two, yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, so Peter can be a bit confusing. When someone says Peter, you've got two different people, but it's like, which one do you have in your head? Most people tend to smash the two together, and you get this kind of disciple apostle. But I think it's important for historical context to note that the Peter that's in Paul's epistles is not the same guy as the Peter who's in the Gospels and in Acts. That's quite clearly a later invention, a character, but they named a lot of the disciples after apostles. So if you go in the context of Paul, you just don't use the word disciple because there are no disciples in Paul's
Yeah,
letters.
not yet. I got you, man. Awesome.
Yeah, but we've got a pretty solid case for connection because Peter wasn't a name. Nobody was called Peter at the time. It was like a nickname or a title, maybe. So when you've got a guy
Do you even
named
think that
Peter,
the term Peter was like even used in Jewish culture?
well, it was a word. I'm trying to remember whether is Peter the Greek or the Latin version, and
Oh, it
then
may
you've
have been a
got,
Greek version. Okay, I see.
because I think they use a transliteration of the Aramaic kephas, which means
Okay.
stone, into Peter, which I think is the Greek for stone.
Okay.
Petros, the rock. So
Gotcha.
it's his actual name would be Kephas, but then they would call him Peter in Greek, effectively, like
Mhm.
translating the name.
So,
and then
so
of
the
course
church described those names. Gotcha.
yeah, so it's possible that his actual name is Simon because he gets called Simon Peter in the Gospels, but we don't know whether that's actually true. It's just a bit of guesswork, to be honest, for lack of a better name. So yeah, it's difficult to tell.
Yes,
But
it is.
right, we're like 2 hours in, so I might leave it there and leave some for the rest.
Sounds good.
Another
Excellent show.
So I mean, doing like every Wednesday or every other Wednesday seems to be working out well. So I'll probably schedule one again. So anyone who subscribes to the Pangburn channel should pick that up. It'll show up as something when I schedule it. So, but yeah, thanks. I've appreciated this, and hopefully we'll get some more brave callers in next time. I know there's a bunch of people listening who haven't called in, so yeah, we'll see you next time, guys. Oh wait, no, Jenny is calling in. We can continue a little bit. All right. Just bring Jenny in. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for calling in.
If you need to go. I just popped into the room, so I didn't catch what you talked about.
That's fine. I just didn't want to like monologue for ages on my own because that's boring. It's more fun having conversations. So, yeah. Yeah, I was still talking about the same subjects, like whether a guy named Jesus actually existed in history. We've had some interesting conversations with Christians and non-Christians. So, I wasn't sure if there was anything you wanted to add.
Well, I went and found that atheist book you told me to read, and I read the introduction, and I tried to read the first chapter. It was Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene. I thought the
Yes, yeah,
intros.
it was a book on
I
biology.
thought the intros were really
from the
interesting
1970s.
because he was, kind of explaining his reasoning for the updates. So you got to feel for where he was going. And then I read half of the first chapter, and I got to tell you, it was so depressing that I just couldn't read anymore. It was so nihilistic and kind of dark. And I've struggled a lot with depression in my life, and I thought, I really don't need to fill my mind with this stuff. It's just so negative. So
That's fair enough.
feel like
I didn't get that feeling from it, but if that's what you
I
felt,
feel like I made a
fair
good
enough.
faith effort to read it. I really planned to read it, but I don't think I've got the gumption to read one of his books, much less all of his books.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, you don't need to read all of them. But can I ask what it was that made you depressed about it?
It was just the feeling, just the overall feeling, the vibe. And, I'm someone who's into musical theater, so I'm really into just energy and how does something feel energetically when I listen to music or I watch a play or, experiencing something creative. It was like the anti-creative feeling, anti-excitement. It was just really dark.
Yeah, it's a science book, so it's all based on like facts and evidence, and it's not so much like the creative style. It's not like a fantasy book or anything. So I could get why you might feel that way. I think
That was
his
pretty
prose
much all.
is really well written, though.
That was pretty much all I wanted to share. I mean, I don't know the science. I really don't care about the science per se. I'm much more into emotion and kind of following where my heart leads with intuition.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I used to be very much that way. I was a worship leader for years. I used to like play and sing guitar in front of church, and it was very much about the feelings for me. And I used to mostly read like science fiction and fantasy books. But you kind of change over time. I end up now I mostly read non-fiction books, which is a big change for me. So it's interesting to see how people's people sort of shift interests over time. Usually, like you get really interested in something, you pursue it for a certain amount of time, you kind of exhaust it, and then move on to another thing. So I don't know whether that will happen to you, whether you'll like pick up new interests and jump into them as well, or whether you've already done that actually.
Well, I'm getting pretty old. I'm 54. And I really enjoy reading my favorite authors over and over again. And
I do have some books I read like that. I've read Terry Pratchett's books probably 10 times each.
yeah, I think I'm on my like 12th go round of the Anne of Green Gables series by Lucy Maud Montgomery. I love all the Jane Austen books. I've read those numerous times. And they feel like old friends to me who I can rely on to be consistent and loving. And I love the humor in both of those authors' works. So I really enjoy good comedy. But
Yeah, it's just good to have a laugh, and quite often if you have like general feelings of depression or anything like that, then it's really good to get into some escapist fantasy and just enjoy yourself. Like you owe your body maintenance and you owe your mind maintenance and looking after yourself. So that's perfectly
that's
valid way to
that's
spend your
really
time.
that's what it came down to with reading Dawkins. It was like, I don't think I can stomach this. It just felt like it was going to demoralize me too much. Have you read Orson Scott Card? If you like science fiction, he's my favorite.
Which series did he write? What book
He
was that?
was
It sounds
Ender's
familiar.
Game. Ender's Game. It was made into a
Oh yeah,
movie.
yeah. I really enjoyed Ender's Game. I didn't read the sequel, but
Oh,
I did.
there's been like 10 sequels. Speaker for the
Okay.
Dead and
I was going through a list of the top 100 sci-fi books, and his was one of them, and I did really enjoy that. I noticed they changed the nickname for the movie, like they didn't call the aliens buggers anymore.
gosh, I didn't even notice that, but I'm not surprised. It's kind of a dark term.
Yeah, the movie was really good. Really good acting in it, and I noticed that it focused on the child actors quite a lot, whereas normally you'd like focus on the adult big name actors, but they did a really
Well,
good job with
the
the movie
the
adaptation.
kids in the book are the stars, so it
Yeah,
didn't surprise
absolutely.
me,
So
even with Harrison Ford in the cast, that the kids were going to be the focus of the movie.
yeah.
I
I
didn't
thought
really
it was
like the
a
movie.
good directing choice. There are movies about kids where they focus too much on the adults because they're the big name draws, but
Yeah.
I think Ender's Game did it well. They focused on the kids.
Yeah, I didn't like the movie because I just felt like they couldn't do justice to the book, but that's almost always the case.
You
So
never can. You're always better off watching the movie first and then reading the book, because the movie can't get you inside the heads of the characters. It can't spend
absolutely.
pages just thinking about
Although I tell you, I
motivations.
think Peter Jackson and Lord of the Rings, they came pretty darn close.
They did
I
quite a good
just
job. They had
love
to
those
chop and
movies.
change things a lot, but I mean, yeah, the moving Shelob around, I thought it was a good choice to remove Tom Bombadil because he was really
Tom
weird.
Bombadil, yes. How could they leave Tom out? Colossal
Yeah, they did
mistake.
a great adaptation. It was very well done.
Yeah. No, they just did it right because they invested so many resources. Those are also some of my favorites, Tolkien, and I love to read Ayn Rand, her books in political theory. I read those in high school, and they really shaped my thinking.
All right, I've never
Atlas
read Ayn
Shrugged,
Rand myself.
The Fountainhead. You haven't read Atlas?
I know of her work, but
Oh,
I've
you
never
should read
actually
Atlas
read it.
Shrugged.
The
You want to talk
closest I
about good
came was
vibes?
I played the game BioShock, which was apparently written based on her political ideals, but no, I've not actually read her work.
Oh, I want to challenge you the way you challenged me with Dawkins. It's life-changing to read Atlas Shrugged because, and this is why she's so brilliant, she almost reserves more venom for the fascists in the book than she does for the communists. And she really kind of nails them in the heart with their bowing down to the money tied to the government, even more than the left, who want to be socialists and kind of just live off the taxpayers. She really gets to the heart of the issue, which, in my opinion, politically, I think the Rockefeller Republicans, we call them Rhino Republicans, are more problematic for America than any sort of leftist progressive cause. I know you're not an American, but Ayn Rand just really saw things clearly, and the fact that she wrote the book 70 years ago, it's just amazing. It's like she was just a prophet.
That's fair enough. It's a 67-hour audiobook. I bought it, but I can't promise I'll finish it anytime soon.
Yes, it's definitely a slog, but that's one that I've also read about, I think, 12 times now.
That's longer than the books in the Song of Ice and Fire, so yeah, hefty.
I gave the opening speech at the first Denver Tea Party, the first Colorado Tea Party, back when Barack Obama was first inaugurated in 2009. And I talked about Atlas Shrugged and going Galt and what that meant and what we should do to fight back against the Marxist moonbats who had taken over the government. And it was quite well received. We've got a lot of libertarians out here in Colorado.
Yeah, it's not something that exists in my country, so that's new for me.
Well, good talking to you about books. I wish I could talk to you about Jesus not being real, but it's not really my thing.
No, that's fair enough. I respect that. And thanks for calling in. I appreciate the conversation.
All right. Well, you take care.
You too. Thanks. And there's one other comment there by Peter Box talking about the greatest show on earth, Evidence for Evolution. Yeah, that's a really good book. It lays out the evidence for evolution systematically and in quite an interesting way. He picks some great examples, just interesting case studies in evolution, like obviously the Lenski experiment with the E. coli bacteria metabolizing citrate. It's a really interesting case of these, I think it was lizards that were moved from one island to another, and they switched from insectivores to herbivores in only a few generations, something like 14 generations, I think it was. It might have been 14 years, actually. But yeah, some really good examples there. But yeah, we've gone way off topic at this point, so I think I'm going to close it since it's been nearly 2.5 hours, and we will do this again sometime. And I encourage people to bring in new arguments, new examples, call in if you haven't done before, or if you want to revisit something. And yeah, thanks, guys.